Chapter 1: Broken Promises and New Beginnings. Pamela Johnson's fingers tightened around her ledger book as she watched Davis pace across her small apartment. The late afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, catching dust motes swirling in his wake. Behind him, her workbench was illuminated in golden light, glass bottles and copper stills gleaming amid bundles of dried herbs and flowers. "The mine was a sure thing, Pamela," Davis said, running a hand through his sandy hair. "No one could have predicted that vein would play out so quickly." Pamela inhaled deeply, drawing in the calming scent of lavender and bergamot that permeated the room from her morning's work. The familiar scents did little to soothe her today. $5,000, Davis. She kept her voice level, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "My entire savings." Davis stopped his pacing and turned to her, his handsome features arranged in an expression of earnest contrition she'd seen too many times before. "I know it looks bad right now, but these things happen in mining. Even the most experienced prospectors hit dry spells." "Dry spells?" Pamela set the ledger down with deliberate care. "You promised me it was a guaranteed investment. Those were your exact words." "And I believed that. You know I wouldn't deliberately mislead you." He crossed to her, took her hands in his. His palms were smooth. Not the hands of a man who'd been working a mine. "Look, I feel terrible about this. I do, but I've already found another opportunity." Pamela stared at their joined hands, remembering when his touch used to make her heart flutter. Now she felt nothing but a cold weight in her stomach. "An opportunity," she repeated flatly. "Yes." Davis's face brightened, his blue eyes sparkling with renewed enthusiasm. "There's a fellow in Denver who's developed a new method for extracting silver, more efficient than anything currently being used. He's looking for investors, and he's offering preferential shares to the first 5 who commit." He released one of her hands to gesture expansively. "This could be twice as profitable as the mine would have been. We'd recoup your initial investment in just a few months, and then the real money starts flowing in." Pamela pulled her hands from his grasp and stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. "And how much is this miraculous opportunity going to cost?" Davis's smile faltered slightly. "Well, that's the thing. The minimum investment is $2,000. The room seemed to still around her as his words hung in the air. $2,000? She echoed, disbelief coloring her tone. "I know it's a lot to ask right now," Davis hurried on, "but this is exactly the chance we need to recover what we've lost. I've seen the diagrams of his extraction process. It's brilliant, revolutionary." Pamela turned away, walking to the window that overlooked Redstone Ridge's main street. Below, a wagon laden with timber rumbled past. She watched it absently, her mind racing through calculations. $2,000 was nearly all she had left in her account. Money earmarked for the spring order of essential oils from San Francisco, new bottles from the glassworks in Denver, labels from the print shop. Without those supplies, her fledgling perfume business would falter, just as it was beginning to gain a foothold. "I know what you're thinking," Davis said, coming up behind her but not quite touching her. "It seems risky, but sometimes you have to take a chance to make real money. You've always said you wanted to expand the shop, maybe open a second location someday. This could make that happen years sooner than you planned." Pamela remained silent, watching a group of children chase a hoop down the dusty street. His words were like a script she'd heard before. Always the next opportunity, the big break just around the corner. Her silence clearly unnerved Davis. He moved around to face her, his expression growing more animated. "Look, timing is crucial here. There are only 5 preferential shares available, and I know for a fact that 3 have already been claimed. We can't afford to hesitate." "We?" Pamela finally turned to look at him. "If I recall correctly, you didn't contribute a single dollar to the mine investment. It was my $5,000. And now you want $2,000 more?" Davis had the grace to look momentarily abashed, but he recovered quickly. "You know my situation, Pamela. Everything I had was tied up in the stage line before it failed. I'm rebuilding, same as you were after you came west. The difference is, I see opportunities that could benefit us both." "The stage line," Pamela shook her head slightly, "another venture I helped finance. And it would have succeeded if the railroad hadn't changed their route. That wasn't my fault." "No, of course not." Pamela's voice had grown quiet. Just like the failed dry goods partnership wasn't your fault, or the lumber speculation. She moved away from the window, putting distance between them. Nothing is ever your fault, Davis. His confident expression faltered. That's not fair. I've had some bad luck, but no, Pamela cut him off. It's not bad luck, it's bad judgment. And I've been foolish enough to fund it for the past 2 years. Pamela, please. His tone shifted, becoming softer, more intimate. You know how much you mean to me. We're partners in this. Together. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Partners? A partner shares the risk, Davis. A partner contributes something beyond grand ideas and promises. I've contributed plenty, he protested, his charming facade beginning to crack. Who found you this apartment when you first arrived? Who introduced you to every business owner in town? Who convinced Harrison to stock your perfumes in his general store? And you've been well compensated for those contributions, Pamela replied evenly. The watch you're wearing? I bought that after the first order from Harrison's store. The boots? A gift when you started the stage line. Even the shirt on your back came from the profits of my little hobby, as you like to call it. Davis's hand went unconsciously to the silver pocket watch chain stretched across his vest. He opened his mouth to respond, but Pamela continued. I've been adding up the figures, Davis. Do you know what I discovered? Over the past 2 years, I've given you more than $7,000 for your various ventures, not including the mine. That doesn't count the gifts, the dinners, the times I've covered your tab at the hotel when you were entertaining potential investors. She walked to her dresser and pulled open the top drawer, removing a small wooden box. $7,000 that could have expanded my business, $7,000 that could have secured my future. She set the box on the table between them. But no more. Davis stared at the box, then at her, his expression wavering between disbelief and dawning realization. What are you saying? I'm saying it's over. The words felt strange on her tongue, but also right, final. I want you to take your things and leave. Now. Pamela, you're overreacting. He attempted a laugh that came out strained. We've had setbacks before. We'll recover. No, Davis, I will recover. You'll move on to your next willing investor. She gestured to the box. Take your belongings and go. He made no move toward the box. You can't be serious. Over one bad investment? It's not just the mine. It's the pattern. It's the realization that I've been financing a dream that benefits only you. Pamela's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Please leave. And if I refuse? Davis's charming demeanor had completely dissolved now, revealing a harder edge beneath. Then I'll be forced to involve Sheriff Lawson. Pamela met his gaze directly. I believe he'd be interested to learn about the money you still owe at the Cattleman's Hotel, not to mention your outstanding debt at Harrison's store, debts I've been quietly covering these past months. Davis's face flushed. For a moment, Pamela thought he might argue further, but then his shoulders slumped slightly. This is ridiculous. You're making a mistake. He snatched the box from the table, but made no move to open it. When you calm down and think this through, you'll realize what you're throwing away. The only thing I'm throwing away is the illusion that you've ever had my best interests at heart, Pamela replied. She moved to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. Davis stalked toward the exit, pausing on the threshold. You'll regret this. When this new extraction method makes investors rich, you'll remember this day. Pamela said nothing, simply holding the door as he stepped through. She closed it behind him with a finality that sent a shiver through her, then turned the key in the lock. For a long moment, she stood with her back against the solid wood, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The apartment felt suddenly larger, as if Davis's departure had created a vacuum. She wasn't sure if the sensation was liberation or loneliness. A soft knock on the door made her start. Had he returned already? Pamela, it's Sarah. Are you all right in there? Relief flooded through her as she recognized her neighbor's voice. She turned and opened the door to reveal Sarah Wilkins standing in the hallway, a steaming teapot in one hand and 2 cups in the other. I heard raised voices, Sarah said, her kind face creased with concern. And then I saw Mr. Miller storming down the stairs looking like a thundercloud. I thought you might need this. She lifted the teapot slightly. Pamela felt tears prick behind her eyes at the simple kindness. You heard? The walls aren't exactly thick, Sarah admitted, stepping inside when Pamela moved aside. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but she shrugged apologetically. It's all right, Pamela closed the door. I suppose the whole building will know by morning. And half the town by noon, Sarah said with a small smile, setting the tea things on the small table by the window. She was a widow of around 40, with practical hands and a warm manner that had made her Pamela's first true friend in Redstone Ridge. But if anyone is foolish enough to gossip in my hearing, they'll get an earful about that silver-tongued wastrel and how you're well rid of him. Pamela couldn't help but smile as she fetched a pot of honey from her cupboard. Is that what you think? That I'm well rid of him? Sarah snorted as she poured the tea. That man's been living off your good nature and hard work since you arrived in town. About time you saw it. She paused, looking up with sudden concern. I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me. No, Pamela shook her head, accepting a cup. You're right. I've been a fool. Not a fool, Sarah corrected gently. Just someone who wanted to believe the best of a man who didn't deserve it. She sipped her tea. If you don't mind my asking, how much did you lose on this latest scheme of his? $5,000 in the mine, and he wanted $2,000 more for some new extraction method. Pamela's hands tightened around her cup. Nearly everything I've saved. Sarah's eyes widened. Good heavens. No wonder you finally showed him the door. I should have done it long ago. Pamela stared into her tea. I kept telling myself the next venture would be different, that he just needed one success to prove himself. Men like Davis Miller don't change, dear. They just find new stories to tell and new people to tell them to. Sarah reached across the table to pat Pamela's hand. You're young, smart, and talented. Your business is growing. You'll recover from this setback. Pamela nodded, wishing she shared her friend's certainty. I'll have to work twice as hard now. The spring orders. She trailed off, mentally recalculating what she could afford. One day at a time, Sarah advised. Today you've taken a difficult but necessary step. Tomorrow you'll figure out the next one. They talked until the teapot was empty and the sun had slipped below the horizon. When Sarah finally took her leave, Pamela felt steadier than she had in hours. Alone again, she lit the lamps and moved to her workbench. The familiar array of bottles, herbs, and essential oils comforted her. This, at least, was real. Something she had built with her own hands and knowledge. She picked up a small vial of her latest creation, a blend of lavender, bergamot, and sandalwood that had taken weeks to perfect. The label read Resilience, a name she had chosen for its subtle strength and enduring quality. How ironic that she'd need to embody those very traits now. Pamela uncorked the vial and dabbed a drop of the perfume onto her wrist, inhaling the complex, layered scent. As the mingled notes filled her senses, she made a silent promise to herself. No more easy faith in charming words, no more investments in other people's dreams at the expense of her own. From now on, she would put her trust in what she could create with her own hands. She was still at her workbench when the last stagecoach of the day rumbled down the street below, bringing with it the evening mail delivery. Tomorrow there would be orders to fill, supplies to inventory, and hard decisions to make about how to move forward with diminished resources. But tonight, amid the comforting scent of her creations, Pamela Johnson began to rebuild. I want my things back, Pamela said, the words coming out with surprising steadiness. Davis's eyebrows shot up. What things? Pamela crossed to the dresser, her steps deliberate. She pulled open the bottom drawer and removed a small wooden box, the cedar still fragrant despite the years since her father had carved it for her 10th birthday. She set it on the table with a decisive thud. Everything I've given you. She lifted the lid and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I made a list. Davis's laugh held a note of disbelief. A list? You can't be serious. The silver pocket watch and chain. Pamela tapped the paper. The leather boots I commissioned from Mr. Tillman when you started the stagecoach business. The wool coat from Denver. Now, wait just a minute, Davis interrupted, his charming demeanor slipping. Those were gifts. You can't demand gifts back. Can't I? Pamela fixed him with a level gaze. Those weren't tokens of affection, Davis. They were business investments. Your words, not mine. You said a successful businessman needs to look the part. She held out her hand. The watch, please. Davis's hand went instinctively to his vest pocket. This is ridiculous. So is losing $5,000 on a played-out mine, the watch. His face hardened, the handsome features she'd once found so captivating now twisted with indignation. You're overreacting. Every investment carries risk. The boots, too, Pamela continued, as if he hadn't spoken. And that shirt. I purchased the fabric when Harrison's store got that shipment from St. Louis last fall. Davis stared at her, momentarily speechless. Then his expression shifted, a calculating look entering his eyes. Come now, Pamela, he said, his voice softening as he took a step toward her. You're upset, I understand, but surely we can discuss this like reasonable... There's nothing to discuss. Pamela took a deliberate step back. Our arrangement is over. I want my things returned, now. Davis's facade cracked. You want me to strip right here? Have you lost your mind? You can keep the trousers, Pamela replied, her voice cool despite the heat rising in her cheeks. The rest comes off. I won't be treated this way. Davis's voice rose. After everything I've done for you. Done for me? Pamela's careful control slipped. What exactly have you done for me, Davis, besides taking my money and my time? I introduced you to everyone in this town. I helped you establish your business and charged a steep price for it. Pamela stood her ground. The watch, Davis. Now. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then, with a muttered curse, he yanked the silver timepiece from his pocket, chain and all, and slammed it onto the table. Happy now, he sneered. The boots and shirt, too. This is insane. Davis's voice grew louder. I'm not stripping for you, Pamela. Then leave them at my shop tomorrow, she countered, along with anything else on that list. Or what? His eyes narrowed. You'll call the sheriff over a shirt and some boots? Pamela raised her chin. No. I'll tell Sheriff Lawson about the 3 months' rent you owe Mr. Peterson at the hotel, and about the unpaid tab at Harrison's store that I've been covering without your knowledge. She paused, letting the words sink in. The sheriff takes a dim view of men who don't pay their debts. Davis paled slightly. She could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. You wouldn't. Try me. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. This isn't over, Davis said finally, his voice low. Pamela moved to the door and pulled it open, a clear dismissal. Yes, it is. Davis stalked toward the door, his movements stiff with anger. He stopped on the threshold, turning back to her. When you calm down and realize what you're throwing away, goodbye, Davis. For another long moment, he stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. Then he jammed his hat onto his head and walked out. Pamela closed the door behind him and turned the key in the lock with fingers that had begun to tremble. She leaned against the solid wood, suddenly unable to trust her legs to support her. It was done. 2 years of hopes and disappointments ended in a few bitter minutes. She slid down the door until she sat on the floor, knees drawn up to her chest like a child. A long, shuddering breath escaped her, carrying with it some of the tension that had held her rigid during the confrontation. What now? The question echoed in her mind as she stared at the silver watch still lying on the table. $5,000 gone. Most of her remaining funds earmarked for supplies she couldn't function without. 2 years wasted on a man who had seen her only as a convenient source of capital. A soft knock at the door startled her from her spiraling thoughts. She stiffened, wondering if Davis had returned. Pamela? Are you all right, dear? The voice belonged to Sarah Wilkins, her neighbor from across the hall. Relief washed through her. Just a moment, she called, scrambling to her feet and smoothing her skirts. She opened the door to find Sarah standing there, a teapot in one hand and 2 cups in the other. I thought you might need this, Sarah said, her kind eyes taking in Pamela's expression. These walls aren't exactly thick, you know. Despite everything, Pamela felt a smile tug at her lips. That obvious, was it? Let's just say Mr. Miller's voice carries. Sarah hefted the teapot. May I come in? Pamela stepped aside, grateful for the company. Please. Sarah was a widow of 40-odd years who lived on the small income from her late husband's blacksmith shop, now run by his former apprentice. She'd been the first to welcome Pamela when she'd moved into the building 2 years earlier, offering friendship and practical advice about setting up shop in Red. I've added a little honey, Sarah said, pouring the tea. Always helps in times of distress. Pamela accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around its comforting warmth. Thank you. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, steam rising from their cups, the apartment quiet save for the ticking of the mantel clock. So, Sarah said finally, you showed him the door. Pamela nodded, taking a careful sip of the hot tea. I should have done it months ago. Better late than never. Sarah settled back in her chair. If you don't mind my saying so, that man was never worthy of you. I'm beginning to realize that. Pamela stared into her cup. I've been such a fool. Nonsense, Sarah said firmly. You wanted to believe in someone. There's no shame in that. There's when you keep believing despite all evidence to the contrary. Pamela shook her head. Do you know how much I've given him over the past 2 years? Between the investments and the gifts and covering his debts? I can guess. Sarah's expression was sympathetic but not pitying. But what's done is done. The question is, where do you go from here? Pamela sighed. I don't know. The mine investment took almost everything I'd saved. I have enough for the essentials, rent, food, the basic supplies to keep the shop running. But the expansion I'd planned... She trailed off, the dream seeming suddenly distant. Your perfumes are the finest between Denver and San Francisco, Sarah said, matter-of-factly. Everyone says so, you'll rebuild. I wanted to order those new glass bottles from the Denver Glass Works, Pamela said, more to herself than to Sarah. And there's a supplier in San Francisco who has jasmine oil from India. I'd planned to create a new line for spring. She looked up, a flash of the old determination in her eyes. I still can. It will just take longer now. Sarah smiled. That's the spirit. They talked until the tea was gone and the shadows had lengthened across the floor. Sarah shared town gossip, carefully avoiding any mention of Davis, and Pamela found herself laughing, despite the heaviness in her heart. When Sarah finally left, promising to bring fresh bread in the morning, Pamela stood in the center of her small apartment, surveying the space that suddenly seemed empty without the larger-than-life presence that had filled it so often these past years. No, not empty. Peaceful. She moved to her workbench where bottles and vials gleamed in the fading light. This was her true passion, the work that sustained her, not just financially but spiritually. Davis had always dismissed it as her little hobby, but even he had grudgingly acknowledged the increasing demand for her creations. Pamela lifted a small green bottle and removed the stopper, inhaling the complex scent of bergamot, sandalwood, and a hint of vanilla, a perfume she'd named Possibilities. It had been her first commercial success, the fragrance that convinced Harrison to stock her products in his general store. She had created that without Davis's help. She could create more. Setting the bottle down, she lit the lamp on her workbench and pulled out her formula book. If she couldn't afford the jasmine oil immediately, perhaps she could develop something using the lavender and rose geranium she already had in stock. Something new, something uniquely hers. As twilight deepened into dusk outside her window, Pamela Johnson bent over her workbench, her hands steady as she measured drops of essential oil into a small beaker. Tonight, she would create. Tomorrow, she would begin to rebuild. Morning sunlight spilled through the shop windows as Pamela arranged a display of perfume bottles on a small table near the entrance. Each crystal vial caught the light, sending rainbow prisms dancing across the polished wood floor. She had slept little, but there was a curious lightness to her movements, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The bell over the door chimed as she adjusted the last bottle. "Good morning, Miss Johnson." The mail carrier, Albert Simmons, stepped inside, his leather bag bulging with the day's deliveries. "Fine day we're having." "Good morning, Mr. Simmons." Pamela smiled. "It is indeed." Albert fished in his bag. "Got a letter for you, all the way from Whitebrook Valley." He handed her a cream-colored envelope addressed in her mother's distinctive flowing script. "Thank you." Pamela set the letter aside as the bell chimed again, announcing her first customer of the day. Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, the banker's wife, entered with a rustle of expensive silk. "Miss Johnson, I do hope you have that lavender water you promised. My headaches have been simply dreadful this week." "Of course, Mrs. Thornton," I prepared it yesterday. Pamela moved behind the counter to fetch the requested tonic, hiding her smile at Mrs. Thornton's theatrical sigh. The woman's dreadful headaches were a well-known excuse for her afternoon naps, but her patronage was too valuable to risk by pointing this out. As she wrapped the lavender water in brown paper, Pamela noticed Mrs. Thornton studying her with unusual intensity. "I hear Mr. Miller left town quite suddenly this morning," the older woman remarked, her tone deliberately casual. "On the early stage to Denver, they say." So it had begun already. Pamela kept her expression neutral as she tied string around the package. "Is that so?" she replied, matching Mrs. Thornton's casual tone. "Quite unexpected, from what I understand." Mrs. Thornton leaned forward slightly. "There's talk of some kind of disagreement." Pamela handed over the package. "People will talk, won't they? That will be 75 cents, please." Mrs. Thornton looked momentarily disappointed at the lack of confirmation, but dutifully opened her reticule to extract the coins. "While you're here," Pamela continued smoothly, "I've just received a new perfume that I think would suit you perfectly." She reached for a small blue bottle. "It's called Dignity. Notes of rose and vanilla with just a hint of bergamot. Very elegant." The diversion worked. Mrs. Thornton's eyes lit up at the prospect of something new and exclusive. By the time she left the shop 15 minutes later, she had purchased not only the lavender water, but also a bottle of Dignity, and had completely forgotten to pursue the topic of Davis's departure. Alone again, Pamela picked up her mother's letter and broke the seal. She scanned the contents quickly, then returned to read more carefully, a small crease forming between her brows. Her cousin Eliza was getting married in 3 weeks. The letter was an invitation, though summons might have been a more accurate description, given her mother's tone. Martha Johnson had never quite reconciled herself to her daughter's decision to establish a business in Redstone Ridge rather than settling near family in White Brook Valley, and there will be several eligible gentlemen in attendance, the letter continued. "Edward Carlyle has asked after you specifically. His father's banking interests have expanded considerably since you last visited, and Edward himself has just been made junior partner, a most advantageous connection for any young woman with sense enough to encourage it." Pamela couldn't suppress a small eye roll. Her mother's attempts at matchmaking were as persistent as they were transparent. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket as the shop bell chimed again. For the next few hours, she was too busy with customers to give it further thought. Word of Davis's departure seemed to have spread throughout Redstone Ridge, bringing a steady stream of curious visitors to her shop, all finding sudden need for perfumes and tonics they'd never purchased before. If business remained this brisk, perhaps the loss of her savings wouldn't be quite so devastating. It was mid-afternoon when Mrs. Thornton returned, this time accompanied by her daughter-in-law, a shy young woman recently arrived from Boston. "Miss Johnson, I simply had to bring Caroline to experience your wonderful shop," Mrs. Thornton announced. "I've told her that your perfumes rival anything she might have purchased back east." "You're too kind," Pamela murmured, though privately she agreed her years of study and experimentation had resulted in fragrances that were indeed comparable to those produced in Eastern cities, if not European ones. As she guided the young woman through her selection of perfumes, Pamela found her thoughts returning to her mother's letter. Perhaps a visit to White Brook Valley wouldn't be such a bad idea. The wedding would provide a respite from Redstone Ridge's gossip, and she could bring samples of her newest creations to show potential customers in a larger market. "What do you think of this one?" she asked, offering Caroline a delicate crystal bottle. "It's called New Beginnings, orange blossom and jasmine with warm amber undertones." Caroline's face lit up as she inhaled the fragrance. "Oh, it's lovely, so fresh and hopeful." "Exactly what I aimed for," Pamela said with a genuine smile. "Sometimes we all need a fresh start." Later, after the shop had closed and the last customer had departed, Pamela sat at her small desk with pen and paper. The letter to her mother was brief but cordial, accepting the invitation to Eliza's wedding and mentioning that she would bring her own selection of perfumes to offer to guests who might be interested. She made no reference to Davis or to her mother's hints about Edward Carlyle. Some topics were better addressed in person, if at all. As she sealed the envelope, Pamela felt a curious sense of anticipation. White Brook Valley had never held much appeal for her. Too settled, too conservative for a woman determined to make her own way in the world. Yet now, the prospect of leaving Redstone Ridge, even temporarily, felt right. Necessary, even. New beginnings, she murmured to herself, glancing at the bottle of perfume she'd shown to young Mrs. Thornton. Perhaps it was time to embrace the sentiment she'd captured in that fragrance. Fresh, hopeful, and full of possibility. Pamela placed the letter on the corner of her desk to be posted in the morning. Then she opened her ledger and began to recalculate her finances, planning not for what she had lost, but for what she might yet create. Chapter 2. Whitebrook Encounters. Pamela braced herself against the worn leather seat as the stagecoach hit another rut in the road. The jolt sent her hatpin digging painfully into her scalp, and she reached up to adjust it with a grimace. 3 hours into the journey to Whitebrook Valley, and every bone in her body protested the punishment. "Terrible roads this time of year," remarked the cattle broker seated across from her. He'd introduced himself as Emmett Holcomb when they'd departed Redstone Ridge, and had been attempting conversation ever since. "Spring rains always turn everything to mud and washboards." "Indeed," Pamela replied politely, turning her attention back to the passing landscape. Through the dust-streaked window, she watched as the familiar pine forests of the higher elevations gradually gave way to rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers. The change in terrain meant they were nearing Whitebrook Valley, a fact that filled her with equal parts relief and apprehension. She tightened her grip on the leather satchel in her lap. Inside were 6 bottles of her finest perfumes, carefully wrapped in soft flannel and nestled in tissue paper. Gifts for the bride, her mother, and Aunt Judith. Though they represented more than mere pleasantries. Each was a silent testament to what she had built on her own, proof that her decision to establish her business rather than marry had been the right one. The broker cleared his throat. "First time to Whitebrook, Miss Johnson?" "No, Mr. Holcomb, my family lives there." She offered a small smile, hoping to discourage further conversation without appearing rude. "Is that so? I'm surprised I haven't made your acquaintance before. I do a fair bit of business in Whitebrook." His eyes lingered appreciatively on her face, then traveled to her well-tailored traveling suit of deep blue wool. "Perhaps I might call on you while you're visiting." The quiet older woman seated beside Pamela looked up from her knitting with undisguised interest. "I'm afraid my stay will be quite brief," Pamela replied. "Just long enough for my cousin's wedding." "Ah, Eliza Kent's wedding to young Harrison, is it? Everyone in 3 counties is talking about it." He smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "I'll be attending myself. Perhaps we might share a dance." Before Pamela could formulate a response that would discourage him without giving offense, the stagecoach lurched around a bend, providing a welcome distraction. Through the window, the full expanse of Whitebrook Valley came into view, a patchwork of farms and pastures stitched together by the silver thread of Whitebrook Creek running through the center. "Beautiful country," the broker commented, following her gaze. "Fertile land, good water, you can see why it was settled first before folks pushed on to places like Redstone Ridge." Pamela nodded absently. The valley was indeed beautiful, but what caught her eye was the town itself, now visible in the distance. Whitebrook was significantly larger than Redstone Ridge, with proper brick buildings lining the main street instead of the predominantly wooden structures of her adopted home. The church steeple rose above the rooftops, gleaming white in the late afternoon sun. It had been nearly a year since her last visit. She'd forgotten how established everything looked, how permanent and proper compared to the rougher, more improvised quality of Redstone Ridge. No wonder her mother had been so dismayed when Pamela chose to set up her business there instead of here. The older woman beside her tucked her knitting into a carpet bag. "First time home in a while, dearie?" she asked, her voice kind. "Nearly a year," Pamela admitted. "Family will be glad to see you then." The woman patted her hand. "Nothing like coming home." Pamela smiled politely, not bothering to correct the assumption that Whitebrook was still home. Home was the small apartment above her shop, with its shelves of bottles and the workbench where she spent hours creating her perfumes. Home was the independence she'd built for herself, even if Davis had nearly destroyed it. The stagecoach slowed as they approached town, the wheels clattering on the sturdy wooden bridge that spanned Whitebrook Creek. Pamela gathered her belongings, mentally preparing herself for what lay ahead. Her mother's letter had mentioned at least 3 eligible bachelors who would be attending the wedding, which meant Martha Johnson was already planning her campaign. "Here we are, folks, Whitebrook Station," the driver called down as they rolled to a stop before a tidy white building that served as both stagecoach office and telegraph station. Pamela allowed Mr. Holcomb to assist her down from the coach, then reclaimed her hand as quickly as politeness permitted. "Thank you, sir. I wish you a pleasant stay in Whitebrook." "I'm certain it will be even pleasanter when we meet again at the wedding, Miss Johnson." He tipped his hat with a confident smile before turning to retrieve his luggage. Pamela scanned the small crowd gathered at the station, her heart lifting when she spotted her mother standing near the building's entrance. Martha Johnson was still a handsome woman despite her 50-odd years, her posture as straight as a cavalry officer's, and her dark hair so like Pamela's own, showing only threads of silver at the temples. "Mother!" Pamela called, raising a gloved hand in greeting. Martha's face brightened. She hurried forward, arms outstretched. "Pamela, my dear, at last!" Their embrace was warm, genuinely affectionate, despite the tensions that often simmered between them. For a moment, Pamela was simply a daughter returning to her mother, and the complicated feelings about her visit receded. Martha held her at arm's length, eyes sharp as she assessed her daughter's appearance. "Let me look at you, thin as a rail as usual. Don't they feed you in that mining town?" "Redstone Ridge is hardly a mining town anymore, Mother, and I eat quite well, I assure you." Martha's tone suggested skepticism. "Well, you're here now, and Judith's cook makes the finest pies in the valley. We'll put some meat on those bones." Her gaze traveled to Pamela's traveling suit. "That's new, isn't it? The color suits you, though the cut is a bit severe for a young woman." And so it begins, Pamela thought, her momentary contentment already fading. "It's practical for travel," she said. "Shall we fetch my trunk? I'm eager to see Aunt Judith and Eliza." "Your trunk's already been seen to. I sent Thomas with the wagon." Martha took Pamela's arm, guiding her toward the street where a smart buggy waited. "I borrowed this from the Prestons. Stephen Preston's wife is one of my best customers. She simply won't let anyone else alter her gowns, says no one has my eye for detail." "Customers?" Pamela looked at her mother with surprise as a young stable boy helped them into the buggy. "You're taking in sewing work?" Martha's chin lifted slightly. "I am, and quite successfully. The finest families in Whitebrook bring me their alterations and special commissions." She gathered the reins expertly. "After your father died, I had to do something, and this is respectable work for a widow. Not everyone has your unconventional ideas about independence." Pamela bit back a sigh. Not 5 minutes in her mother's company, and already they were circling familiar territory. "It suits you," she said instead, noting her mother's dress of good quality blue calico, simply but expertly cut. "You've always had a gift with needle and thread." Martha's expression softened at the genuine compliment. "Thank you, dear." She clucked to the horse, and they set off down Whitebrook's main street. "Now, tell me about your journey. Was it terribly tiresome? These spring roads are wretched." As they drove through town, Martha maintained a steady stream of conversation, pointing out changes since Pamela's last visit. A new millinery shop, the bank's expanded offices, the freshly painted fence around the schoolyard. But as they left the business district behind and turned onto the oak-lined avenue where Whitebrook's more prosperous citizens resided, her talk shifted to the upcoming wedding. "Eliza is beside herself with excitement, of course. The Harrisons are a good family, old money from back east. Thomas Harrison Sr. built that new flour mill last year, and they say it's already showing a handsome profit." Martha glanced sideways at her daughter. "His younger brother Richard will be at the wedding. 32, never married, and heir to his uncle's shipping interests in San Francisco." Pamela stared straight ahead. "How interesting." "Indeed. And Edward Carlyle has asked after you specifically. He remembers you from your last visit. His father's bank now has branches in Denver, and—" "Mother," Pamela interrupted gently, "I've only just arrived. Can we perhaps postpone the matchmaking until tomorrow at least?" Martha sighed. "I'm only thinking of your future, dear. 28 is not remotely close to spinsterhood," Pamela finished for her. "And I have a business that's growing more successful every month." "A business?" Martha shook her head slightly. Selling perfumes and tonics may be a suitable hobby for a young lady, but it's hardly a proper occupation for... It's not a hobby, Mother. It's my livelihood. Pamela's voice remained calm, but she couldn't keep a hint of steel from entering it, and it provides me with independence that many women would envy. Martha fell silent, her expression a mixture of exasperation and genuine concern. Pamela immediately regretted her sharpness. Her mother meant well, even if her ideas about suitable female occupations remained firmly rooted in an earlier era. I've brought some of my newest creations as gifts, she said, softening her tone and patting the satchel in her lap. Special blends for Eliza and Aunt Judith. And one for you, of course. Martha's face brightened. Have you? How lovely. She hesitated, then added, I do use that lavender water you sent at Christmas every night. It helps me sleep like nothing else. The simple admission eased the tension between them. Pamela smiled, genuinely touched that her mother used and appreciated her creations, even while disapproving of her making them for sale. They turned through a pair of wrought iron gates set into a low stone wall and proceeded up a curving gravel drive lined with flowering dogwoods. At the end stood Aunt Judith's house. A gracious two-story structure of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance. It was the finest home in Whitebrook, a fact that Aunt Judith never tired of casually mentioning. As they pulled up to the sweeping front steps, the front door opened to reveal a small crowd of welcoming relatives. Eliza, pretty and glowing with pre-wedding excitement, rushed down the steps first, followed more sedately by Aunt Judith and various cousins. Pamela, you're here at last? Eliza enveloped her in a tight embrace that smelled of rosewater and happiness. I was afraid you wouldn't come. And miss your wedding? Never. Pamela returned the hug warmly. Her younger cousin had always been a favorite, less concerned with propriety than their other relatives. Pamela, my dear. Aunt Judith descended the steps with the deliberate grace of a woman aware of her position in society. Tall and imperious, with silvering hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, she offered her cheek for Pamela to kiss. You look healthy. The mountain air must agree with you. Pamela suppressed a smile at the faint note of disapproval in her aunt's voice. In Judith's world, healthy was barely a step above common. It's wonderful to see you, Aunt Judith. Your home is as beautiful as ever. Yes, well, we've made some improvement since your last visit. The new conservatory is particularly fine. Judith gestured toward the side of the house where a glass structure gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Samuel spared no expense. The glass was imported from Belgium. Samuel Kent, Judith's husband and Eliza's father, appeared behind his wife. A successful businessman with interests in lumber and shipping, he had a hearty manner that contrasted sharply with Judith's refinement. Pamela, by thunder, girl, you're a sight for sore eyes. He clasped her hand in both of his. Still running that little shop of yours in Redstone, are you? Making all those fancy scents? Yes, Uncle Samuel, business is quite good, actually. Is it now? Good for you. His genuine enthusiasm earned him a reproving glance from his wife. Your room is all prepared, Pamela, Aunt Judith said, smoothly taking control of the conversation. You must be exhausted from your journey. Mary will show you up and then you can rest before dinner. She signaled to a maid hovering in the doorway. Thank you, Aunt Judith, but I'm not at all tired. I'd much rather... Nonsense. Travel is always fatiguing, especially on these dreadful roads. Mary, take Miss Johnson's things up to the blue room. Judith turned back to Pamela. Dinner is at 7. We'll be a party of 12 tonight. The Carlyles are joining us, and young Richard Harrison, of course. Martha shot Pamela a meaningful look that clearly said, You see, it begins already. Recognizing defeat, Pamela allowed herself to be led upstairs to the blue room, a spacious guest chamber decorated in varying shades of azure that Aunt Judith reserved for her more favored visitors. Her trunk had already been delivered and stood at the foot of a four-poster bed draped with a silk counterpane. Would Miss like me to unpack for her? The maid asked, hovering by the door. No, thank you, Mary, I can manage. Pamela smiled at the girl, who couldn't have been more than 16. But I would appreciate some hot water for washing. Yes, miss, right away. The girl bobbed a curtsy and departed. Alone at last, Pamela crossed to the window and gazed out at Aunt Judith's immaculate gardens. The contrast between this room and her small apartment above the shop in Redstone Ridge could not have been more stark. Here, everything was elegant, expensive, and designed to impress. Her own quarters were simple, practical, and filled with the tools of her trade. She loved her small rooms with a fierceness that surprised her. They represented everything she'd built for herself, everything she'd fought for. This room, beautiful as it was, felt like a gilded cage. A soft knock announced Mary's return with a pitcher of steaming water. Pamela thanked her and set about refreshing herself for dinner, knowing that Aunt Judith would accept no excuses for tardiness or inappropriate attire. From her trunk, she removed her best dinner dress, a deep burgundy silk with black velvet trim that she'd purchased in Denver the previous autumn. It was fashionable without being ostentatious, elegant without trying too hard. As she dressed, she mentally prepared herself for the evening ahead. There would be probing questions about her business, thinly veiled remarks about her unmarried state, and at least one introduction to an eligible gentleman. The familiar dance would begin again, just as it had during every visit home. But this time was different. This time she came with the bitter lesson of Davis, still fresh in her mind. This time she would be even more watchful, more guarded against charm and flattery. This time she would remember that her independence was hard-won and precious. Pamela secured the last button on her bodice and surveyed her reflection in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her looked composed, confident, and entirely capable of navigating the social currents of an awkward family dinner. Just 3 days, she murmured to herself. Smile, be polite, dance at the wedding, and then back to Redstone Ridge. She opened her satchel and removed a small crystal vial of perfume, her own creation, a blend of bergamot and vanilla that she'd named Resolve. She dabbed a tiny amount behind each ear, drawing strength from the familiar scent. At precisely 5 minutes before 7, Pamela descended the sweeping staircase to join her family in the parlor. The room was already crowded with relatives and guests, the air thick with conversation and competing scents of cologne and pomade. Eliza hurried over immediately, linking her arm through Pamela's. "Thank heavens you're here," she whispered. "Mother has seated you between Edward Carlyle and Richard Harrison. I'm so sorry. I tried to intervene, but you know how she is when she's made up her mind." Pamela squeezed her cousin's arm reassuringly. "Don't worry about me. I can handle Edward Carlyle and a dozen like him. You always were the brave one." Eliza's expression turned mischievous. "Though I must warn you, Richard Harrison is considered quite the catch. Handsome, wealthy, and Boston educated. Half the unmarried ladies in Whitebrook have set their caps for him." "Then he'll be vastly disappointed by my lack of interest," Pamela replied dryly. Aunt Judith's voice cut through the general conversation. "Shall we go into dinner? Samuel, will you lead the way with Mrs. Carlyle?" The party processed into the dining room, where the long mahogany table gleamed in the light of a crystal chandelier. Pamela found herself seated exactly where Eliza had warned, with Edward Carlyle on her right and Richard Harrison on her left. Edward, whom she vaguely remembered from her last visit as a somewhat pompous young man with ambitions beyond his abilities, had apparently prospered in the intervening year. His waistcoat was of the finest brocade, and a diamond stick pin gleamed in his silk cravat. "Miss Johnson," he said, bowing slightly as she took her seat. "A pleasure to see you again. I've thought often of our conversations during your last visit." Pamela doubted very much that they'd had any conversation worth remembering, but she smiled politely. "How kind of you to say so, Mr. Carlyle." "I understand you've established some sort of shop in Redstone Ridge?" His tone suggested he found the idea quaint rather than impressive. "A perfumery, yes. I create custom scents and tonics." "How unusual." He signaled to a servant to fill his wine glass. "Though I suppose it gives you something to occupy your time until you settle into married life." Before Pamela could formulate a response that wouldn't scandalize the entire table, her other dinner partner spoke. "I'd hardly call establishing a successful business something to occupy one's time, Carlyle. It represents significant vision and determination." Richard Harrison's voice was deep and carried the refined accent of someone educated in the East. but there was a note of genuine respect in it that surprised Pamela. She turned to find herself looking into a pair of remarkably intent gray eyes, set in a face that could indeed be described as handsome, if somewhat austere. Richard Harrison appeared to be in his early 30s with dark hair and the kind of features that suggested breeding and education. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said cautiously, wondering if this was merely a more sophisticated version of the flattery she'd grown wary of. "Not at all. My mother operated a small but successful millinery shop in Boston before her marriage. She often said it was the most rewarding work of her life." His expression remained serious, but there was a warmth in his eyes that suggested sincerity. "I'd be interested to hear more about your business if you'd care to share." For a moment, Pamela was too surprised to respond. Here, amid her family's thinly veiled disapproval and the assumptions of men like Edward Carlyle, was someone who seemed to genuinely respect her endeavors. "I'm sure Miss Johnson would prefer not to discuss trade at the dinner table," Edward interjected smoothly. "Such matters are hardly suitable conversation for mixed company." Richard Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I wasn't aware that perfumery fell into the category of inappropriate dinner conversation, Carlyle. It seems a perfectly innocent topic to me." "Perhaps we might discuss the weather instead," Pamela suggested, her tone light but firm. "I noticed the dogwoods are particularly beautiful this year. Aunt Judith, are those new plantings along the drive?" The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Pamela remained aware of Richard Harrison beside her, his occasional comments revealing an intelligence and wit that stood out amid the general banality of dinner table talk. Despite her resolve to remain unimpressed by any of her aunt's selected suitors, she found herself curious about this man who spoke of his mother's business with respect rather than condescension. As the meal progressed through multiple courses, Aunt Judith was determined to impress her guests with both the skill of her cook and the capacity of her china cabinet. The conversation inevitably turned to the upcoming wedding, and by extension to marriage in general. "It's such a blessing to see young people making suitable matches," Mrs. Carlyle said, beaming at Eliza and her fiancé, Thomas Harrison, Jr., who sat at the opposite end of the table. "Though it seems more and more young ladies these days are in no hurry to settle down." Her gaze drifted meaningfully toward Pamela. "Perhaps they're waiting for matches that are more than merely suitable," Richard Harrison commented, his tone casual but his meaning clear. "Suitability is nothing to dismiss lightly, Richard," his brother Thomas said with the complacent air of a man who had done everything expected of him. "Shared backgrounds, compatible families, appropriate expectations, these are the foundations of a successful marriage." "And what of compatibility of minds, of spirits?" Richard countered. "Surely those matter at least as much as whether one's grandmother was a Carter or a Lee." A small silence fell over the table at this mild challenge to conventional wisdom. Aunt Judith cleared her throat delicately. "Well, I'm sure we all wish Eliza and Thomas every happiness," she said, clearly steering the conversation back to safer waters. "The wedding preparations are coming along splendidly. The flowers arrived from Denver yesterday, and the new silver service your father ordered has finally been delivered." This last was addressed to Thomas with a smile that suggested approval of such extravagance. As the conversation turned to the minutiae of wedding planning, Pamela felt herself relaxing slightly. She'd survived the first round of questioning about her business and marital status without creating a scene or offending anyone important. 2 more days of this, and she could return to the blessed simplicity of Redstone Ridge. But as she sipped her wine and nodded at appropriate intervals, she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Richard Harrison, who seemed equally detached from the wedding chatter. Once, she caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression that suggested he found her as much a puzzle as she found him. How strange, she thought, to encounter someone in Whitebrook who didn't immediately fit into the familiar patterns she'd come to expect. Perhaps this visit would hold more surprises than she'd anticipated. Pamela rose before dawn the next morning, habit driving her from bed despite her body's protests after the long journey. Through the window of the blue room, she watched the first golden light spill across Aunt Judith's immaculate gardens, illuminating dew-spangled rose bushes and neat gravel paths. For a moment, she allowed herself to admire the beauty before her, so different from the rugged mountain vistas visible from her apartment window in Redstone Ridge. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Mary with hot water and a breakfast tray. "Begging your pardon, miss," the young maid said as she set the tray on a small table near the window. "Mrs. Kent thought you might like to take breakfast in your room, what with all the commotion downstairs. The flowers from Denver just arrived, and she's in quite a state about the arrangements." "Thank you, Mary." Pamela eyed the generous portions of scrambled eggs, ham, and fresh bread with appreciation. "But I'd like to help with the preparations. Just let me dress, and I'll come down." Mary's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure, miss? Mrs. Kent can be a bit particular about how things are done." Pamela smiled. "I'm well acquainted with my aunt's particular nature. I'll tread carefully." After a hasty but satisfying breakfast, Pamela dressed in a practical day gown of sage green cotton suitable for garden work. She pinned her dark hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck and made her way downstairs, following the sounds of female voices to the back of the house. Aunt Judith's spacious kitchen had been transformed into a floral workshop. The massive oak table at the center of the room was covered with buckets of freshly cut flowers: roses, lilies, daisies, and sprays of greenery. Eliza and 3 female cousins clustered around the table, tying small bouquets with ribbon, while Aunt Judith supervised with the precision of a military commander. "No, no, Rebecca, the ribbon must be precisely 2 inches wide, not an inch more or less. And Margaret, you're using far too much fern. The effect should be delicate, not overwhelming." Pamela's mother stood nearby, her expert fingers working swiftly to craft a corsage of pink rosebuds. She spotted Pamela first. "There you are, dear. Did you sleep well?" "Wonderfully, thank you." Pamela approached the table, surveying the colorful chaos. "How can I help?" Eliza looked up with relief. "Oh, Pamela, thank goodness. Could you help with the boutonnieres? Cousin Margaret was supposed to do them, but she's been reassigned to table arrangements." Margaret, a plump girl of 20 with a perpetually anxious expression, shot Pamela a grateful look. "I kept making them too large. Aunt Judith says they're meant to be subtle." "I'm sure I can manage." Pamela took the vacant chair beside Eliza and reached for a spray of lily of the valley and a length of thin wire. The work was precise but soothing, not unlike the careful measuring and mixing required for her perfumes. Soon she had established a rhythm, creating neat, elegant boutonnieres that even Aunt Judith grudgingly approved. As they worked, conversation flowed around her, mostly wedding details and local gossip. Pamela was content to listen until Rebecca, her youngest cousin at just 17, turned the attention her way. "Pamela, you simply must tell us about your shop. Is it terribly exciting to run your own business?" Her eyes shone with genuine curiosity. "I can't imagine being so independent." "It's certainly never dull," Pamela replied, carefully wiring a small sprig of fern to a rosebud. "Every day brings different challenges." "And customers? Do you get many gentlemen customers?" This came from Margaret, whose color heightened slightly at her own daring. "Some, mostly buying gifts for mothers or sisters." Pamela smiled at her cousin's obvious interest. "Though I do create colognes for gentlemen as well." "You mentioned a Mr. Miller in your letters," Rebecca continued, leaning forward eagerly. "The one who helped you establish your business connections. Is he still advising you?" Pamela's fingers stilled momentarily. She'd written about Davis several times, presenting him in the most favorable light possible, partly to placate her mother's concerns about her living alone in Redstone Ridge, and partly because she genuinely believed in his potential at the time. "No," she said finally. "Mr. Miller and I no longer have a business relationship." "Or any other kind of relationship, I hope," Martha interjected, looking up from her corsage. "I never did approve of that arrangement, Pamela. A young woman relying on a man who isn't her husband for business advice. It invites gossip." Eliza, sensing her cousin's discomfort, tried to change the subject. "The weather promises to be perfect for the wedding, not a cloud in the forecast." But Rebecca was not so easily diverted. "But aren't you lonely, Pamela? Running a shop all by yourself, with no one to share your life with?" "I have friends in Redstone Ridge," Pamela replied evenly, "and my work is fulfilling." "But surely you hope to marry someday," Margaret joined in, abandoning all pretense of focusing on her floral arrangement. "Someone as pretty as you must have suitors." Pamela set aside a finished boutonniere and reached for more lily of the valley. "My focus is on building my business, not securing a husband." But your business is well established now, isn't it? This came from Aunt Judith, who had been listening with poorly concealed disapproval. Surely it's time to consider your future. A woman alone in the world is a pitiable thing. I'm hardly alone, Aunt Judith. I have a thriving business, good friends, and family, even if they are a day's journey away. Pamela kept her tone light, but she felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders. And I don't find independence pitiable in the slightest. Independence is all well and good for a young woman, Martha said, setting aside a finished corsage, but it's not a substitute for a proper home and family. Pamela looked up to find her mother watching her with a mixture of concern and exasperation. There's nothing improper about my home, Mother. A room above a shop is hardly a suitable residence for a woman of your background, Pamela. Martha's voice remained gentle, but her conviction was clear. Your father would have expected better for you. The mention of her father, a sore point between them, caused Pamela's carefully maintained composure to slip. My father left us with nothing but debts and broken promises. I've built something secure, something that can't be taken away by a man's poor decisions. A brief, awkward silence fell over the table. Pamela immediately regretted her sharp words, not for their truth, but for the pain that flashed across her mother's face. I believe we have enough boutonnieres, she said, rising from her chair. If you'll excuse me, I need some fresh air. Without waiting for a response, Pamela made her way through the kitchen and out the back door into the garden. She walked briskly, not caring which path she took as long as it led away from the suffocating weight of expectations and disapproval. Eventually, she found herself in a secluded corner of the garden she remembered from childhood visits, a small artificial pond surrounded by weeping willows and flowering shrubs. A stone bench sat near the water's edge, partially hidden by a curtain of willow branches. It had been her hiding place years ago, when visits to Aunt Judith's became overwhelming. Pamela sat on the cool stone, removed her hat, and tugged off her gloves. She took a deep breath, then another, willing her racing heart to slow. It wasn't fair to blame her mother for clinging to conventional ideas about women's roles. Martha had suffered terribly when Pamela's father abandoned them, left with a young daughter to raise and no skills beyond those expected of a gentleman's wife. That was precisely why Pamela had been determined to forge a different path, to create security that depended on no one but herself. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She hastily began to replace her hat, not wanting to be caught in a state of disarray by one of her cousins. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. I didn't realize anyone was here." Pamela looked up, startled by the deep masculine voice with its distinct southern drawl. A man stood at the edge of the willow's curtain, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensively tailored suit that emphasized his athletic build. "I was just leaving," she said, rising from the bench. "Please, don't go on my account." He stepped forward into the dappled shade, revealing a face that would have been harshly handsome if not for the warmth in his dark eyes. "I'm the one intruding," Pamela hesitated, torn between the desire for continued solitude and the dictates of politeness. The man looked to be in his mid-30s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She didn't recognize him, which was unusual in a town the size of Whitebrook. "Are you here for the wedding?" she asked, deciding that brief conversation would be less awkward than fleeing. "I am indeed," he smiled, revealing a dimple in his right cheek that softened his otherwise commanding presence. "Chad Montgomery at your service. I'm a business associate of Samuel Kent's, Lumber and Shipping." His accent caught her attention, distinctly Southern, but not the refined tones of Virginia or the Carolinas. Something deeper, richer. Alabama, perhaps, or Mississippi. It reminded her uncomfortably of her father's voice, with its honeyed cadences that could make even the most outrageous falsehoods sound sincere. "Pamela Johnson," she replied, more coolly than she'd intended. "Eliza Kent is my cousin, Miss Johnson." He inclined his head slightly, his intense gaze studying her with interest. "I hope I haven't interrupted a private moment. You seemed deep in thought." "Just catching my breath between wedding preparations. Aunt Judith, Mrs. Kent, runs a tight ship." Chad Montgomery's laugh was unexpectedly warm. "So I've gathered. I made the mistake of offering a suggestion about the seating arrangements and received a look that could have frozen the Mississippi in August." Despite her instinctive wariness, Pamela found herself smiling. "That sounds like Aunt Judith. She doesn't welcome input on matters she considers her domain, which is essentially everything under her roof. A formidable woman. He glanced around the secluded garden nook. This is a lovely spot. I can see why you chose it for a moment's peace. I used to hide here as a child when visits became overwhelming. The admission slipped out before she could consider it, and Pamela immediately wondered why she was sharing such a personal detail with a stranger. Ah, so you're not a resident of Whitebrook? Chad leaned against the trunk of the willow, his posture relaxed but his eyes keenly attentive. No, I live in Redstone Ridge. The mining town? That's quite a distance to travel for a wedding. Former mining town, Pamela corrected, finding herself oddly irritated by the common misconception. And family obligations often require sacrifice. His eyebrows rose slightly at her tone. I've offended you. My apologies, Miss Johnson. I didn't mean to speak disparagingly of your home. Pamela sighed. No, I'm the one who should apologize. I've become rather defensive about Redstone Ridge. People tend to dismiss it as a rough mining outpost when in fact it's developed into a respectable community with proper businesses and services. Including yours? His question caught her off guard. I beg your pardon? You speak like someone with a vested interest in the town's reputation. I'm guessing you own one of those proper businesses? His smile held no mockery, only genuine interest. Pamela studied him, trying to discern his intent. Men rarely showed interest in her business except as a way to gain her attention, and ultimately to suggest she'd be better off married than managing a shop. I own a perfumery, she said finally. I create custom scents and tonics. The lady perfumer from Redstone Ridge. Chad Montgomery's expression brightened with recognition. I've heard about your establishment. Samuel Kent mentioned it with considerable pride, said his niece had a remarkable nose and a good head for business besides. Pamela blinked in surprise. Uncle Samuel had always been supportive of her endeavors, but to hear he'd spoken of her business with pride to associates was unexpected. That's kind of him. Not kind. Accurate, I'd wager. Chad pushed away from the tree and took a step closer. I've always admired those with the courage to forge their own path. It takes a special kind of determination, especially for a woman in these times. There was something in his direct gaze that unsettled Pamela, not in an unpleasant way, but in a manner that made her suddenly conscious of her unpinned hair and gloveless hands. He looked at her as if he could see beyond the polite facade she maintained, straight through to the doubts and determination beneath. It's not courage so much as necessity, she replied, reaching for her gloves. I needed to support myself, and I had a skill that proved marketable. You're too modest, Miss Johnson. Many women in your position would have chosen an easier path, marriage to a suitable gentleman perhaps, or a position as a companion or governess. His eyes never left her face. Instead, you built something of your own. That takes courage, regardless of the initial motivation. Pamela felt a flush rising to her cheeks. His words mirrored her own thoughts too closely for comfort, and the intensity of his gaze made her uncharacteristically flustered. You seem to have formed quite a detailed opinion of me based on very little information, Mr. Montgomery. I'm a good judge of character. The smile returned, warming his eyes. It's essential in my line of work. And what line is that, exactly? Beyond being a business associate of my uncle's, primarily lumber with interests in shipping and railroad development. He spoke without the boastfulness she'd come to expect from successful men. I own several timber operations across 3 states with headquarters in Mississippi. The confirmation of his southern roots caused Pamela's wariness to return. Her father had been a southern gentleman with extensive business interests as well, or so he'd claimed. In reality, he'd been little more than a confidence man with an elegant accent and expensive tastes. I should return to the house, she said, settling her hat firmly on her head. They'll be wondering where I've gone. Of course. Chad stepped aside to clear her path. May I walk with you? Politeness dictated she accept, though a part of her wished to maintain her solitude a bit longer. If you wish. They fell into step along the garden path, Chad shortening his stride to match hers. For a moment they walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant call of birds. Will you be staying in Whitebrook long after the wedding, Miss Johnson? Chad asked eventually. No, I plan to return to Redstone Ridge the day after. My shop can't remain closed indefinitely. Such dedication to your business is admirable. Pamela glanced sideways at him, trying to detect any hint of condescension in his tone, but found none. It's necessary. I'm the only perfumer between Denver and Salt Lake City. My customers rely on me. And do you enjoy it? The creating, I mean. The unexpected question made her pause. Men rarely asked about the satisfaction her work brought her, focusing instead on the practical or financial aspects, or dismissing it entirely. Very much, she admitted. There's something transcendent about capturing a precise scent, the perfect balance of notes, the way they change and develop over time. It's like creating a memory in a bottle. A gentle smile curved his mouth. You sound like an artist discussing her medium. I suppose it is a kind of art, Pamela said, surprised by his perception, though most consider it merely a trade. Merely a trade? There's no merely about creating something of value with your own hands and mind. His voice held conviction. Whether it's a perfume, a building, or a business empire, creation is always worthy of respect. They had nearly reached the house now. Through the kitchen window, Pamela could see her cousins still busy with floral arrangements. She slowed her steps, oddly reluctant to end the conversation. You have unusual opinions for a businessman, Mr. Montgomery. Do I? He stopped, turning to face her. Or perhaps I simply recognize quality when I encounter it. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something disconcerting about the way he looked at her, as if he was committing every detail of her face to memory. I'm going to marry you, Miss Johnson. The words were spoken so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment Pamela wasn't certain she'd heard correctly. I beg your pardon? I said, I'm going to marry you. Chad's expression remained perfectly serious, though a hint of that dimple appeared in his cheek. I realize that's a rather startling declaration from a man you've just met, but I believe in speaking plainly. A startled laugh escaped her. Mr. Montgomery, that's absurd. You don't even know me. I know enough. His gaze never wavered. Sometimes a man just knows, Miss Johnson. The moment I saw you sitting by that pond, I knew. Pamela stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the wink, some indication that he was teasing. But his expression remained serious, his eyes intent on hers. You're joking, she said finally. This is some peculiar Southern humor that I don't quite grasp. No joke, Miss Johnson, merely a statement of future fact. His smile deepened, revealing both dimples now. You don't believe me now, which is perfectly understandable. But you will. Pamela found herself at a rare loss for words. The man was either delusional or possessed of an arrogance beyond anything she'd encountered. And yet there was something so earnest in his expression that she couldn't simply dismiss him as she would have most men who made such an outlandish claim. I need to return to my duties, she said finally, gathering her composure. Good day, Mr. Montgomery. She turned toward the house, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and a more complex emotion she refused to examine. Will you save me a dance tomorrow, Miss Johnson? Chad called after her, his deep voice carrying easily across the garden. Pamela kept walking, giving no indication that she'd heard. But as she reached the kitchen door, a small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. Of all the outrageous, presumptuous, utterly confounding men. She smoothed her expression before stepping inside, but her thoughts remained in the garden with the strange Southerner who had declared his intentions with such bewildering confidence. There you are, Eliza exclaimed as Pamela entered. We're about to send out a search party. Aunt Judith needs your opinion on the table arrangements for the wedding breakfast. Pamela nodded, but her mind was only half on the sprays of flowers and trailing ribbons her cousin showed her. The other half remained fixed on dark eyes, a dimpled smile, and the most audacious declaration she'd ever received. I'm going to marry you, Miss Johnson. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh aloud. She had sworn off men entirely after Davis, and even if she hadn't, a Southern businessman with an accent that echoed her father's would be the last man she'd consider. And yet, as she mechanically arranged flowers and nodded at her aunt's directions, Pamela found herself wondering if she would, indeed, save a dance for Chad Montgomery. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of Eliza's bedroom, creating dappled patterns across the wedding gown laid carefully across the four-poster bed. The dress was a marvel of ivory silk and Belgian lace, with tiny seed pearls adorning the bodice and a train that would trail majestically down the church aisle. "I think I might be ill," Eliza whispered, her face pale beneath the elaborate curls that had taken Martha an hour to arrange. Pamela looked up from where she was adjusting the wreath of orange blossoms that would secure Eliza's veil. "Nonsense. You're just nervous. Every bride is." "But what if I trip? Or forget my vows? Or what if Thomas changes his mind?" Eliza's hands fluttered like trapped birds. "Thomas Harrison has been in love with you since you were 16, Pamela said firmly, setting aside the wreath and taking her cousin's trembling hands. "He looks at you as if you hung the moon and stars. As for tripping, I'll be right behind you, ready to catch you if need be." Eliza managed a shaky smile. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Pamela. You're always so certain about everything." Pamela squeezed her hands. "Not everything," she admitted, "but I am absolutely certain that you're going to be a beautiful bride and that Thomas is a fortunate man." A knock at the door announced Aunt Judith, resplendent in lavender silk with an impressive array of ostrich feathers adorning her hat. "It's time, Eliza. The carriages are ready." She surveyed her daughter with a critical eye. "You look lovely, dear, though I still think the Brussels lace would have been more elegant than the Valenciennes." "The Valenciennes was grandmother's," Eliza said, a hint of steel beneath her nervous demeanor. "I promised her I would wear it," Aunt Judith relented with a slight nod. "Well, it's charming enough, I suppose. Pamela, help her with the gown and mind the train doesn't drag." The next half hour passed in a flurry of activity as Eliza was carefully dressed, the gown's myriad tiny buttons fastened, the veil arranged, and final touches applied. When at last she stood before the full-length mirror, even Aunt Judith fell silent in admiration. "Oh, my dear," Martha said softly from the doorway. "You're absolutely radiant." Pamela felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion as she looked at her cousin. There was something ethereal about Eliza in that moment, poised between girlhood and womanhood, her face alight with nervous joy beneath the delicate veil. "It's time," Aunt Judith said, her own voice suspiciously husky. "Samuel is waiting downstairs." The journey to Whitebrook's church was a blur of last-minute adjustments and whispered reassurances. Pamela, seated beside Eliza in the flower-bedded carriage, found herself reflecting on the contrast between her cousin's path and her own. Two women the same age, yet walking such different roads. As the carriage pulled up before the church, Pamela pushed the thought aside. Today was Eliza's day, and she would focus only on helping her cousin navigate its emotional currents. The white-clapboard church with its soaring steeple was filled to capacity, fragrant with lilies and roses. Organ music swelled as Pamela processed down the aisle ahead of the bride, conscious of the curious gazes that followed her. Most of Whitebrook's residents knew she was the peculiar Johnson daughter who ran a business instead of seeking a husband. Her eyes swept across the assembled guests, noting familiar faces from childhood, and then stopping abruptly when she encountered a pair of dark eyes, watching her with undisguised interest. Chad Montgomery sat among the town's most prominent citizens, impeccably dressed in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He inclined his head slightly when their gazes met, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Pamela quickly looked away, disconcerted by the jolt of awareness that shot through her. She took her place at the altar, turning to watch as Eliza entered on Uncle Samuel's arm. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its time-honored simplicity. Eliza's voice trembled only slightly as she spoke her vows, while Thomas's rang out with confident joy. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. As the newlyweds processed back down the aisle, Pamela found herself once again the focus of Chad Montgomery's intent gaze. This time she held it for a moment before deliberately looking away. His presumption the previous day still rankled, fascinating though she found him. The reception was held in Aunt Judith's gardens, transformed for the occasion with white silk ribbons, flower garlands, and hundreds of paper lanterns waiting to be lit as dusk fell. Tables laden with elaborate refreshments dotted the lawns, while a small orchestra played from a specially constructed pavilion. For the first hour, Pamela successfully avoided both Chad and her mother's matchmaking efforts by staying close to the bride and groom, helping Eliza manage her train and ensuring her cousin had moments to eat and drink amid the constant stream of well-wishers. "You can't hide behind me all afternoon," Eliza murmured during a brief lull. "Mother says Mr. Montgomery has been watching you since we arrived." "Your mother should mind her own affairs," Pamela replied, though she felt a telltale warmth creep into her cheeks. "Besides, I'm not hiding. I'm assisting the bride, as any good cousin should." Eliza laughed. "Well, this bride is ordering you to enjoy yourself. Go dance, have some champagne. Thomas and I are perfectly capable of receiving guests without your supervision." Before Pamela could protest further, she spotted her mother approaching with determined purpose, towing a reluctant-looking Edward Carlyle in her wake. "I think I'll get some punch," she said hastily, slipping away through the crowd. For the next half hour, Pamela circulated among the guests, exchanging pleasantries and deflecting questions about her return to Redstone Ridge. She had just begun to think she might escape the afternoon without further uncomfortable encounters, when her mother materialized at her elbow. "There you are, dear. I've been looking everywhere for you." Martha's cheeks were flushed with excitement. "There's someone you simply must meet, the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, and he's asked specifically to be introduced to you." "Mother, please," Pamela protested as Martha took her arm in a surprisingly firm grip. "I'm not interested in meeting eligible bachelors." "Don't be ridiculous, Pamela. Even a woman of independent means should keep her options open." Martha steered her determinedly through the crowd. "Besides, this gentleman is different. He's a businessman himself, very successful, so he might actually appreciate your little shop." Pamela resigned herself to another awkward introduction to some self-important merchant or banker. "Very well, but just a brief introduction. I promised Eliza I'd help with the cake cutting." "I'm sure Eliza will understand a small delay," Martha said as they approached a group of men engaged in conversation near the rose garden. "Ah, Mr. Montgomery, here she is, as promised." Pamela froze as the men turned, and she found herself looking directly into Chad Montgomery's amused dark eyes. "Miss Johnson," he said, bowing slightly, "a pleasure to see you again." "Again?" Martha looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "Have you already met?" "Yesterday in the garden," Chad explained smoothly. "Miss Johnson was kind enough to engage in conversation with a stranger who interrupted her solitude." Pamela found her voice at last. "Mr. Montgomery failed to mention he was acquainted with you, Mother." "Oh, we met just this morning," Martha said, beaming. "Mr. Montgomery approached me to inquire about you. Naturally, I was happy to sing your praises." Her expression held a mixture of pride and triumph that suggested she considered this a masterstroke of maternal matchmaking. "How fortuitous," Pamela said, shooting Chad a look that promised retribution. If he noticed her displeasure, he gave no sign. "Would you do me the honor of a dance, Miss Johnson?" he asked, extending his hand just as the orchestra began a waltz, with her mother watching expectantly and several nearby guests openly eavesdropping. Pamela had little choice but to accept. "I'll dance," she said, placing her gloved hand in his. Chad led her onto the dance floor with surprising grace for a man of his size. His hand at her waist was warm and steady as they joined the other couples circling beneath the early evening sky. As the shadows lengthened, servants moved among the trees and bushes, lighting the paper lanterns that cast a golden glow over the garden. "You seem displeased, Miss Johnson," Chad observed as they moved in perfect rhythm to the music. "Have I offended you in some way?" "You deliberately sought out my mother," Pamela replied, keeping her voice low, "after making that ridiculous declaration yesterday." "It wasn't ridiculous, merely premature." His hand tightened slightly at her waist as he guided her through a turn. "And yes, I did seek out Mrs. Johnson. I wanted to learn more about the fascinating woman I met in the garden." "So you admit you were deceptive yesterday, pretending our meeting was coincidental when you already knew who I was?" Chad's eyebrows rose. "I never claimed our meeting was coincidental, Miss Johnson. Nor did I know who you were until you introduced yourself. I simply recognized your name when you gave it." Pamela frowned, trying to detect falsehood in his steady gaze. Then why were you in that particular part of the garden? It's quite secluded. For the same reason you were, I suspect, to escape the wedding preparations for a few moments of peace. His smile was rueful. Samuel Kent had me cornering lumber suppliers all morning. By noon I needed respite. The simple explanation rang true, yet Pamela was not entirely convinced. But you admitted to my mother that you inquired about me. After our meeting, Chad clarified. I was intrigued by the lady perfumer of Redstone Ridge. Your mother was only too happy to tell me about your business, with some editorial comments about its suitability as an occupation for a gentlewoman. Despite herself, Pamela felt a reluctant smile tug at her lips. I can imagine those comments quite vividly, Chad chuckled, the sound warm and surprisingly intimate in the space between them. She clearly loves you very much, even if she doesn't entirely understand your choices. Few people do, Pamela admitted, surprised by her own candor. I do. His tone was serious now, his dark eyes intent on hers. It takes courage to build something of your own, to trust your own judgment and abilities rather than following the prescribed path. You're not what I expected, Mr. Montgomery, Pamela said after a moment. No, the dimple appeared in his cheek. And what did you expect? From a Southern businessman? Condescension, at the very least, perhaps thinly veiled disapproval of a woman in trade. Ah, but I'm not just any Southern businessman. Chad guided her smoothly around another couple. I built my fortune from nothing after the war. I have rather more respect for those who create their own destiny than those who merely inherit one. The waltz was drawing to a close, and Pamela realized with surprise that she was reluctant for it to end. Something about this man challenged her assumptions and piqued her curiosity in equal measure. And what about your declaration yesterday? She asked as the final notes sounded. Was that merely designed to intrigue me? Not in the slightest. Chad's hand remained at her waist as the music ended. I meant every word, Miss Johnson. I intend to marry you. Before Pamela could formulate a suitable response to such audacity, Martha appeared beside them, practically vibrating with excitement. Oh, what a handsome couple you make, she exclaimed, heedless of Pamela's warning glance. Mr. Montgomery, you must tell Pamela about your cattle ranch. It's the largest in the Mississippi Territory, isn't it? And you mentioned investments in railroads as well? Chad smiled at Martha's transparent enthusiasm. Among other ventures, yes. Timber remains my primary interest, but I've diversified considerably over the years. Mother, Pamela began, attempting to reclaim control of the conversation, but Martha was unstoppable. And to think you're willing to travel all the way to Redstone Ridge. Such dedication deserves recognition, doesn't it, Pamela? Pamela blinked, momentarily confused. Travel to Redstone Ridge. Mr. Montgomery has expressed interest in calling on you there, Martha explained, her expression suggesting Pamela was being deliberately obtuse. I assured him you would welcome the visit, of course. Did you indeed? Pamela looked from her beaming mother to Chad's carefully neutral expression. How very presumptuous. Not at all, Chad interjected smoothly. Mrs. Johnson merely confirmed that your business keeps you primarily in Redstone Ridge. I informed her that I would be traveling in that direction next month on business and asked if it would be acceptable for me to pay a call while in town. You see, dear, perfectly proper. Martha patted Pamela's arm. Now, I believe Aunt Judith is looking for you. Something about helping Eliza change for the wedding journey? It was a transparent attempt to leave Pamela alone with Chad, but it provided a welcome escape nonetheless. Of course, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Montgomery. Until next month, Miss Johnson. Chad took her hand and bowed over it, his lips barely brushing her gloved knuckles. I look forward to seeing your establishment. Pamela withdrew her hand, ignoring the tingling sensation his touch had produced even through the barrier of kid leather. Safe travels, Mr. Montgomery. As she made her way back to the house, Pamela's thoughts whirled in confusion. The man was presumptuous, overconfident, and entirely too sure of his own charm, all qualities she had resolved to avoid after her experience with Davis. And yet, there was something compelling about Chad Montgomery's directness, about the way he spoke of her business with genuine respect rather than tolerant amusement. He looked at her as if he saw someone worth knowing, not merely a woman who had failed to secure a husband. Ridiculous, she muttered as she climbed the stairs to Eliza's room. The man is practically a stranger, and a southern one at that. But as she helped her cousin change from her wedding gown into a smart traveling suit for her honeymoon journey, Pamela found herself wondering what Chad Montgomery would think of her modest shop in Redstone Ridge. Would he find it quaint and provincial after his extensive business holdings? Or would he see, as she did, the potential for something greater? "You're 1,000 miles away," Eliza observed as Pamela absently handed her a hat pin. "Does it have anything to do with that handsome Mr. Montgomery I saw you dancing with?" "Don't be absurd," Pamela replied too quickly. "I was thinking about inventory I need to order when I return home." Eliza's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled in the slightest. "If you say so, cousin, though I must say he couldn't take his eyes off you all afternoon." "Eliza Kent. I mean, Harrison. Stop matchmaking on your own wedding day," Pamela exclaimed, though she couldn't entirely suppress a smile. "Focus on your own husband, not on finding one for me. Can't I do both?" Eliza laughed, then sobered slightly. "I just want you to be happy, Pamela, and not everyone would expect you to give up your independence. The right man would cherish it as part of who you are." The echo of Chad's words from their dance made Pamela pause. "Perhaps," she conceded. "But I'm not looking for the right man, Eliza. I'm perfectly content as I am." "If you say so." Eliza adjusted her traveling hat one final time. "But promise me something. Don't dismiss Mr. Montgomery out of hand just because he's Southern and successful. Judge him on his own merits." "I always judge people on their merits," Pamela protested. "Do you?" Eliza's gaze was unexpectedly shrewd. "Or do you sometimes judge them based on who they remind you of?" The question struck uncomfortably close to Pamela's earlier thoughts about Chad's accent and its similarity to her father's. Before she could respond, however, there was a knock at the door announcing that the carriage was ready to take the newlyweds to the train station. In the flurry of goodbyes, heartfelt embraces, and thrown flower petals, Pamela had no further opportunity to ponder her cousin's question. But later that night, as she packed her trunk for her own departure the next morning, she found herself replaying moments from her dance with Chad Montgomery. "I intend to marry you," he had said, with a confidence that should have been offensive, but somehow wasn't, as if he had glimpsed some future that remained hidden from her. "Presumptuous man," she murmured, folding her dinner dress carefully. "As if I have any intention of marrying again after Davis." But as she closed her trunk and prepared for bed, Pamela admitted to herself that she was, perhaps, the smallest bit curious to see if Chad Montgomery would indeed call on her in Redstone Ridge next month, purely out of academic interest, of course, to see if his fine words about respecting her business were genuine or merely a novel approach to courtship. It meant nothing that she found herself wondering what he would think of her newest perfume creation, or whether his hands would be as warm without gloves as they had been while dancing. Nothing at all. Chapter 3. Return to Redstone Ridge. Pamela turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to her shop, breathing in the familiar mingled scents of lavender, bergamot, and cedar. After a week away, returning to her own space felt like slipping into a comfortable dress after days of formal attire. The morning sun filtered through the front windows, illuminating the neat rows of crystal bottles on the shelves and the polished oak counter where she conducted her business. Home. Despite her mother's persistent belief that Pamela would eventually come to her senses and return to Whitebrook Valley, this modest shop with its adjoining workroom and the small apartment above had become the center of her world. Here, she answered to no one but herself. She set down her reticule and moved through the familiar space, running her fingers lightly along the counter's edge. A fine layer of dust had accumulated during her absence, expected but still requiring attention before customers arrived. Removing her gloves and hat, she retrieved a soft cloth from beneath the counter and began to polish the glass display case. The rhythmic motion soothed her still unsettled thoughts. The wedding had been beautiful, Eliza radiant with happiness, but the unexpected encounter with Chad Montgomery had left Pamela with a strange restlessness she couldn't quite shake. His bold declaration and the promise of a visit to Redstone Ridge next month lingered in her mind like a half-remembered melody. Foolishness, she murmured, applying more vigor to her polishing. The man was a stranger, charming perhaps, but still a southern businessman with an accent that reminded her too much of her father's broken promises. She had work to do, a business to run, and no time for distractions, particularly male ones. By 9 o'clock, the shop was immaculate, the displays rearranged to highlight her newest creations, and the receipt book open on the counter ready for the day's transactions. Pamela had just finished pinning her hair up more securely when the bell above the door announced her first customer of the day. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, entered with a rustle of taffeta and the enthusiastic greeting of a woman who lived for town gossip. "Miss Johnson, you've returned at last. How was the wedding?" "Absolutely charming, I expect, knowing your aunt's taste. Though, of course, nothing like what we would have arranged here in Redstone. We're far more modest in our celebrations." "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy," Pamela smiled, recognizing the familiar pattern of the woman's conversation. Mrs. Abernathy would pretend to disparage Whitebrook Valley's pretensions while secretly envying them, then transition to whatever gossip she deemed most valuable as currency. "The wedding was lovely. My cousin made a beautiful bride." "I'm sure she did, dear. Youth has its own beauty, doesn't it?" Mrs. Abernathy removed her gloves and approached the counter. "I've come for another bottle of that wonderful lavender water. My nerves, you know. Dr. Wilson says my constitution is particularly delicate." As Pamela retrieved the requested tonic from the shelf behind her, Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward confidentially. "I suppose you haven't heard the latest about Mr. Miller, being away and all." Pamela's hand faltered briefly before closing around the blue glass bottle. "No, I haven't," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I've only just returned." "Well," Mrs. Abernathy's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of being the first to deliver significant news. "He was at Donovan's saloon 2 nights ago, buying drinks for anyone who would listen to his plans for some new mining venture. Something about a revolutionary extraction method." She lowered her voice. "They say he's already raised nearly $3,000 from investors in Denver, the amount so close to what Davis had asked her for before their final confrontation sent a cold feeling through Pamela's chest. $3,000 from other unsuspecting serfdoms, while her own $5,000 was likely gone forever. "How interesting," she managed, wrapping the lavender water in brown paper with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will. "That will be 75 cents, please." Mrs. Abernathy counted out the coins, her expression making it clear she had expected a more dramatic reaction. "They say he's left town now, headed for California or some such place, though not before settling his account at Harrison's store, I understand. Quite surprising, given his reputation for financial unreliability." Pamela tied the package with string, her mind racing. Davis settling his debts, that was unlike him, unless... "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Abernathy," she said, handing over the wrapped bottle. "I hope the lavender water brings you relief." "Oh, it always does, dear." Mrs. Abernathy tucked the package into her reticule. "Such a gift you have. I always tell Mr. Abernathy your tonics work better than half of Dr. Wilson's prescriptions, though of course I'd never say so to the doctor himself." After Mrs. Abernathy departed, Pamela leaned against the counter, processing what she'd heard. Davis had apparently found new investors and paid off at least some of his debts before leaving town. The latter was so out of character that she wondered if someone had intervened. Perhaps Harriet Cooper, the town's only lawyer, and one of the few women Pamela counted as a true friend. She had approached Harriet about legal recourse for recovering her investment just before leaving for Eliza's wedding. The shop bell interrupted her thoughts. She straightened, composing her features into a professional smile that faltered when she saw who had entered. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted the portly owner of Redstone Ridge's general store. "What a surprise! I don't usually see you outside your establishment at this hour." Gerald Harrison was normally the most jovial of men, quick with a jest and fond of pinching children's cheeks as he slipped them peppermint sticks. Today, however, his usual ruddy complexion seemed pale, and his customary smile was replaced by a businesslike nod. "Miss Johnson," he said formally, "I trust your journey to Whitebrook was pleasant?" "Very pleasant, thank you." Pamela studied him, noting the way his fingers nervously twisted the brim of his hat. "Is there something I can help you with?" I was planning to deliver your monthly order of rose water and bay rum on Wednesday as usual. Harrison cleared his throat. Yes, about that. I'm afraid I need to make some changes to our arrangement. A prickle of unease ran down Pamela's spine. Harrison's general store accounted for nearly a third of her monthly sales, a steady, reliable income that helped bridge the gaps between direct customer purchases. What sort of changes? She asked, keeping her voice even. Harrison wouldn't quite meet her eyes. I've been approached by a distributor from St. Louis. Factory-made perfumes and tonics, very modern, pre-bottled with printed labels, he gestured vaguely. The customers, you see, they want the latest products, things they've read about in the ladies' magazines. My products have sold consistently well in your store for over 2 years, Mr. Harrison, Pamela said, a hint of steel entering her voice. I don't recall any customer complaints. No complaints at all, Harrison hastened to assure her. Fine products, very fine. But times are changing, Miss Johnson. People want what's new, what's advertised in the Eastern papers. And these factory-made perfumes, they're to replace mine entirely? Pamela asked, already calculating the impact on her finances. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Not entirely, no, but I'll need to reduce your shelf space considerably. Perhaps just a small display near the counter for your most popular items. I see. Pamela folded her hands on the counter to hide their slight tremor. And may I ask what prompted this sudden change? You seemed quite satisfied with our arrangement when we spoke last month. A flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Crossed Harrison's face. Business decisions, Miss Johnson. Purely business. The distributor offers very competitive terms. He hesitated, then added in a tone that attempted kindness but achieved condescension. You understand, in these modern times, a small operation like yours can't really compete with established companies, particularly when... He trailed off. When the operation is run by a woman? Pamela finished for him, her voice cool. Harrison had the grace to look embarrassed. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Pamela drew herself up to her full height. Very well, Mr. Harrison. I'll adjust my production accordingly. Will you still want the bay rum? I understand your male customers are particularly fond of it. Harrison nodded, seeming relieved that she wasn't going to argue further. Yes, the bay rum sells well. Perhaps 12 bottles per month instead of the usual 24. I'll have them ready on Wednesday. Pamela moved toward the door, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Good day, Mr. Harrison. When the bell jangled behind him, Pamela remained still for a long moment, staring at the polished wood of the door. Then, with deliberate calmness, she turned the sign to closed and retreated to her workroom at the back of the shop. The small room was her sanctuary, walls lined with shelves holding bottles of essential oils, tinctures, and dried herbs. Her workbench dominated the center of the space, its scarred wooden surface bearing the marks of years of experimentation. Pamela moved to the far corner where a small desk held her ledger books and correspondence. Opening the current ledger, she began to calculate rapidly, adjusting figures based on Harrison's reduced order. The loss of income was significant, more than she could easily absorb, especially coming so soon after the loss of her savings to Davis's failed mine. It could be worse, she murmured to herself, tallying the final column. I can still meet the rent and basic supplies, but the new bottles from Denver... She shook her head. The elegant crystal vials she'd planned to order would have to wait. Without them, she couldn't launch the new line of perfumes she'd been developing. Fragrances designed to appeal to the wealthier customers who passed through Redstone Ridge on their way to Denver or Salt Lake City. A gentle knock pulled her from her calculations. Pamela looked up to see Sarah Wilkins peering around the half-open door that connected the workroom to the back alley. I saw Harrison leaving looking like he'd swallowed a lemon, Sarah said, holding up a covered basket. And then you closed the shop. Thought you might need some company and sustenance. Despite her worries, Pamela felt a smile tug at her lips. Trust Sarah to notice and respond with practical kindness. You're a mind reader. Come in. Sarah set the basket on a clear corner of the workbench and began unpacking its contents. Fresh bread, sliced ham, pickled beans, and 2 slices of apple cake. So what did our esteemed shopkeeper want, besides the pleasure of your company first thing on a Monday morning? Pamela sighed, closing her ledger. He's cutting my shelf space to make room for factory-made perfumes from St. Louis. Modern products, he called them. Modern, my foot, Sarah snorted, handing Pamela a plate. Those mass-produced concoctions can't hold a candle to your creations. Anyone with a nose can tell the difference. Apparently, Harrison's customers are clamoring for printed labels and fancy packaging, Pamela said, picking up a slice of bread without much appetite. Or at least, that's what he claims. Sarah pulled up the room's only other chair and sat, her plain, kind face thoughtful. Seems sudden, doesn't it? Harrison's always spoken highly of your products before. It does seem sudden, Pamela agreed. And he was nervous, not looking me in the eye. That's not like him at all. No, it isn't, Sarah frowned. You don't suppose someone's been pressuring him, do you? Who would do that? And why? Pamela shook her head. More likely he's simply gotten a better financial arrangement from this distributor. Business is business, after all. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she changed the subject. How was the wedding? Did your mother try to marry you off to every eligible bachelor in Whitebrook? Despite her concerns, Pamela chuckled. Not every bachelor. She narrowed her campaign to just 3, with special emphasis on Edward Carlyle, whose father owns the bank. The same Edward Carlyle who visited here last summer and referred to your perfumery as a charming little hobby? Sarah rolled her eyes. Your mother has peculiar taste in suitors for you. Pamela hesitated, Chad Montgomery's face appearing unbidden in her mind. There was another gentleman there, a Mr. Montgomery from Mississippi, a business associate of my uncle's. Something in her tone must have alerted Sarah, whose eyebrows rose with interest. And? Was he as condescending as Mr. Carlyle? Actually, no, he was... Pamela searched for the right word. Unexpected. He spoke of my business with genuine respect, said he admired my entrepreneurial spirit. Did he now? Sarah's expression turned sly. And was this Mr. Montgomery handsome by any chance? Pamela felt a betraying warmth rise to her cheeks. His appearance is hardly relevant, but he was not unpleasant to look at. Sarah laughed outright. High praise indeed, coming from you. Tell me more about this not unpleasant gentleman who respects your business. Before Pamela could decide how much to reveal about Chad's outrageous declaration and his promised visit to Redstone Ridge, a sharp knock at the front door of the shop interrupted them. Expecting anyone? Sarah asked, rising. No, and the sign is turned to closed. Pamela set aside her barely touched plate and moved through the workroom to the shop proper. Through the front window, she could see a young boy of about 12 holding an envelope and shifting impatiently from foot to foot. Billy Watson, who ran errands for Harriet Cooper's law office. Pamela unlocked the door. Good morning, Billy. Do you have something for me? Miss Cooper says it's important, ma'am, the boy said, thrusting the envelope toward her. She says you'll want to read it right away. Thank you, Billy. Pamela pressed a penny into his hand along with the envelope. Tell Miss Cooper I'll respond this afternoon. The boy grinned, pocketed both penny and envelope, then dashed off down the street with the boundless energy of youth. Pamela closed the door, looking down at the heavy cream envelope with Harriet's precise handwriting across the front. What is it? Sarah asked, coming up behind her. A letter from Harriet Cooper. Pamela broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet within, her eyes quickly scanning the neat script. She gasped softly. What? What does it say? Sarah peered over her shoulder. Davis has repaid part of my investment, Pamela said, her voice tinged with disbelief. $3,000 delivered to Harriet's office the day before I returned from Whitebrook. 3,000? Sarah's eyes widened. But that's more than half of what he took, Pamela finished, and far more than I ever expected to see again. Well, I'll be odd, Sarah murmured. What prompted this sudden attack of conscience, I wonder? Pamela read further, her brow furrowing. According to Harriet, Davis claimed he'd had an enlightening conversation with a business associate that convinced him to make partial restitution before leaving for California. She looked up at Sarah. What business associate? Davis barely spoke to anyone in town in those final weeks, except to borrow money. Sarah shrugged. Perhaps he found religion? Or more likely, someone made it clear there would be consequences if he didn't make some attempt at repayment. But who would do that? And why? Pamela shook her head, bewildered. It doesn't make sense. Does it matter? You've got $3,000 back that you never thought you'd see again, Sarah pointed out pragmatically. Seems like a stroke of good fortune at just the right moment, given Harrison's news. Pamela folded the letter thoughtfully. Yes, it is fortunate timing. With this unexpected windfall, she could weather the reduction in orders from Harrison's store and still proceed with her plans for the new product line, perhaps even expand her advertising to other towns in the territory. Yet something about the situation nagged at her. Davis was not a man who repaid debts without significant pressure. Someone had intervened, but who? And what had they said to convince him? You're looking suspicious rather than pleased, Sarah observed. Most people would be celebrating. I am pleased, Pamela assured her, tucking the letter into her pocket, just puzzled as well. Sarah gathered up their plates, returning them to her basket. Well, while you puzzle it out, I'd better get back to my mending. Mrs. Thornton's ball gown won't alter itself, and she needs it for the Founders' Day dance on Saturday. She paused at the door. You'll be there, won't you? Everyone's expecting your attendance, especially after missing you during the wedding. Pamela nodded absently, her mind still on the mysterious repayment. Yes, I'll be there. After Sarah left, Pamela returned to her ledger with a lighter heart. The unexpected return of $3,000 changed her financial situation considerably. She could proceed with ordering the new bottles from Denver, perhaps even the jasmine oil from San Francisco that she'd been coveting for a special perfume blend. Yet, as she updated her figures, Pamela found her thoughts straying repeatedly to Chad Montgomery and his promise to visit Redstone Ridge. She couldn't shake the feeling that these recent events, Davis's partial repayment, Harrison's sudden change in their business arrangement, were somehow connected to the Southern businessman who had so boldly declared his intention to marry her. Coincidence, she murmured, closing the ledger, and an overactive imagination. But as she rose to reopen the shop for the afternoon's business, the nagging suspicion remained. Something had changed in Redstone Ridge during her absence, currents shifting beneath the town's placid surface. And somehow, she suspected, Chad Montgomery was at the center of it all. Pamela reread Harriet's letter as she walked the 3 blocks to the lawyer's office that afternoon. The unexpected news of Davis's partial repayment had momentarily overshadowed the first part of Harriet's message, a request to discuss potential legal action to recover the remaining funds. Harriet Cooper practiced law from a modest clapboard building on Oak Street, just off Redstone Ridge's main thoroughfare. The small brass plaque beside the door read simply H. Cooper, Attorney at Law, giving no indication that the H stood for Harriet rather than Henry or Harold. This deliberate ambiguity had served her well when establishing her practice in a profession that remained overwhelmingly male. Pamela knocked briskly, then entered without waiting for a response, familiar with her friend's habits. The front room served as both office and reception area, with bookshelves lining the walls and a substantial desk positioned to catch the afternoon light from the window. Harriet sat behind it, spectacles perched on her nose as she examined a thick legal document. Right on time, Harriet said, glancing up with a smile. At 38, she was a decade older than Pamela, with steady gray eyes and brown hair beginning to show threads of silver. She had none of the softness many associated with femininity. Her figure was spare, her movements efficient, her manner direct to the point of bluntness. These qualities, which might have been considered liabilities in the marriage market, served her well in her chosen profession. Your note said it was important, Pamela replied, taking the chair opposite the desk. Though I admit, I was surprised by the news about Davis's repayment. How did that come about? Harriet removed her spectacles, folding them carefully. That's what I find curious. He appeared at my office last Wednesday, quite early, said he'd come to make partial restitution before leaving town. She leaned back in her chair. He seemed different. Nervous, certainly, but also oddly determined. When I asked what had prompted this sudden attack of conscience, he muttered something about seeing reason after a discussion with a business associate. What business associate? Pamela's brow furrowed. Davis barely had any legitimate business connections left in Redstone Ridge. Most merchants wouldn't extend him credit after the stage line failed. He didn't elaborate, despite my questioning. Harriet's lips curved in a wry smile. And I can be quite persistent when necessary. I don't doubt it. Pamela tapped the letter. You mentioned there might be grounds to recover the rest of my investment? Even though Davis has now left town? Harriet nodded, reaching for a folder on her desk. I've examined the agreement you signed when you invested in the mining venture. Despite Davis's later claims that the money was a gift, this document clearly establishes it as a business investment with expected returns. She extracted a single sheet of paper. Your signature here and Davis's here, witnessed by Mr. Peterson from the Cattleman's Hotel. Pamela leaned forward to examine the document she'd signed nearly 6 months earlier. Davis had drafted it himself, presenting it as a formality to make things official. At the time, she'd been touched by his apparent business acumen and attention to detail. So, this constitutes a legal contract? She asked. Indeed it does. One that Davis breached by misrepresenting the mine's prospects and misappropriating the funds. Harriet's tone was clipped, professional. I believe we have strong grounds to file suit for recovery of the remaining $2,000, plus interest and possibly damages. Hope stirred in Pamela's chest. Even though he's left for California? The law has a long reach, my dear, and California has courts. Harriet leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. However, there are considerations beyond the legal merits of the case. Pursuing this will require time, money for court filings, and possibly travel, and... She hesitated. And? Pamela prompted. And it would inevitably become public knowledge, more so than it already is. Harriet's gaze was sympathetic but direct. A lawsuit would mean testimony in open court, details of your relationship with Davis examined and questioned. In a small town like Redstone Ridge, that means gossip, speculation, judgment. Pamela completed the thought, a heaviness settling in her stomach. She was already the subject of talk as an unmarried businesswoman. A public lawsuit against a former suitor would provide the town gossips with fodder for months. Precisely. Harriet waited, allowing Pamela to consider the implications. The partial repayment, while not complete restitution, is more than many in your position ever receive. You would be justified in accepting it as the best possible outcome. Pamela gazed out the window at the busy street, weighing her options. The $3,000 Davis had returned would allow her to continue her business operations. Even with Harrison's reduced orders, pursuing the remaining $2,000 would mean opening her personal and financial affairs to public scrutiny at a time when she most needed to appear strong and solvent. Yet the thought of Davis escaping with any portion of her hard-earned savings rankled deeply. What would you do, Harriet? She asked finally. If you were in my position? The lawyer considered for a moment. I believe I would proceed, not primarily for the money, though that is rightfully yours, but because men like Davis Miller rely on women's reluctance to create unseemly scenes. They count on our social conditioning to avoid conflict, to accept partial justice rather than demand what is fully owed. Pamela nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her friend's words. Then we proceed. Draft whatever documents are necessary. If Davis believes I'll quietly accept his crumbs of restitution, he's mistaken in his judgment. Again. Very well. Harriet made a note in her ledger. I should warn you that this will not be swift. Legal matters rarely are, especially across jurisdictional boundaries. I understand. Pamela straightened her shoulders. But it's the principle of the matter. I won't allow him to take advantage of me or any other woman. Again, as she left Harriet's office, Pamela felt lighter despite the challenges ahead. Taking action, however difficult, was preferable to passive acceptance of injustice. She had built her business through determination and hard work. She would protect it with the same resolve. 3 days later, Pamela stood on a small stepladder in her shop window, arranging a new display of spring tonics and fragrances. The morning sun cast prisms of light through the crystal bottles, creating a rainbow effect she hoped would catch the eye of passers-by. With Harrison's reduced order still weighing on her mind, every potential customer had become more valuable. She adjusted a bottle of rosewater, angling it to better catch the light, when the sound of horses' hooves and carriage wheels drawing to a stop outside her shop caught her attention. Through the window, she glimpsed a gleaming black carriage, unlike any regularly seen in Redstone Ridge. The vehicle's polished surfaces and brass fittings spoke of wealth and urban sophistication. Curious, Pamela watched as pedestrians on the boardwalk slowed their pace, turning to stare at the unexpected arrival. The carriage door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that would have looked more at home on the streets of Denver or San Francisco than in their frontier town. The bottle of lavender cologne in her hand froze midway to its position as Pamela recognized the unmistakable figure of Chad Montgomery. It had been barely 2 weeks since Eliza's wedding, and Pamela had convinced herself that his promised visit to Redstone Ridge had been mere politeness, or better yet, forgotten entirely. Yet here he was, an apparition of southern sophistication in the midst of Redstone Ridge's dusty frontier reality. The shop bell jangled as he entered, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. Pamela remained motionless on her stepladder, the cologne bottle still suspended in her hand as his dark gaze swept the shop and settled on her with evident pleasure. "Miss Johnson," he said, removing his hat in a fluid motion. "I hope I find you well." Pamela clutched the bottle more securely, suddenly conscious of her position on the ladder and the smudge of dust that likely decorated her cheek. "Mr. Montgomery, this is... unexpected." His smile revealed that dimple that had featured in her thoughts more often than she cared to admit. "I did promise to call when business brought me to the area. My affairs in Denver concluded more swiftly than anticipated, allowing me to visit Redstone Ridge on my return journey." His gaze took in the shop with obvious interest. "Your establishment is charming, exactly as I imagined it." Pamela carefully descended the ladder, setting the cologne bottle safely on a nearby shelf before turning to face him fully. "And how exactly did you imagine it, Mr. Montgomery?" "Orderly. Elegant in its simplicity. A reflection of its proprietor." He moved toward the counter, his confident bearing somehow making the small shop feel even smaller. "The scents are remarkable, layered and complex, yet harmonious." Despite her determination to remain unaffected, Pamela felt a flush of pleasure at the genuine appreciation in his voice. "Thank you. I believe in creating fragrances that evolve with the wearer, rather than overwhelming them." "A philosophy evident in your work." Chad gestured to the display she had been arranging. "Please, don't let me interrupt your preparations. I merely wish to pay my respects while in town." Something in his phrasing caught Pamela's attention. "You're staying in Redstone Ridge, then?" "For a few days. I have some business interests to explore in the area." His eyes held hers with the same directness she remembered from Whitebrook. "The Cattleman's Hotel seems comfortable enough, though I understand it's the only establishment of its kind here. Redstone Ridge is a small town, Mr. Montgomery. We lack the amenities you might be accustomed to in Mississippi or the larger cities. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are found in unexpected places." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that made Pamela's cheeks warm further. Before she could formulate a suitable response, the shop bell jangled again as 3 women entered. Mrs. Peterson, wife of the hotel proprietor, accompanied by her daughter and a friend Pamela recognized as a visitor from a neighboring town, their conversation died abruptly as they noted Chad's presence. "Oh, excuse us," Mrs. Peterson said, her curious gaze traveling between Pamela and Chad. "We didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all," Pamela replied smoothly, stepping behind her counter with professional composure. "Mr. Montgomery was just admiring the shop. How may I help you ladies today?" Mrs. Peterson moved forward, though her attention remained more on Chad than on the displayed perfumes. "We were hoping to find something special for my daughter Catherine. She's to attend her first formal dance next week in Denver." "Of course!" Pamela gestured to the shelves of perfumes. "For a young lady's first dance, perhaps something light and floral? I have a lovely violet and lily of the valley blend that would be perfect for the occasion." As she spoke, Pamela was acutely aware of Chad moving to one side, examining the displays with apparent interest while the women cast surreptitious glances his way. She could almost see the questions forming in their minds. Who was this obviously wealthy stranger, and what was his connection to the town's unmarried female perfumer? "That sounds delightful," Mrs. Peterson replied, nudging her daughter forward. "Catherine, come smell this. Mr. Montgomery, perhaps you might offer a gentleman's opinion? What fragrances do you find appealing on a young lady?" The brazen request made Catherine blush furiously, and Pamela press her lips together to suppress a smile. Chad, however, responded with perfect courtesy. "I believe a young lady's choice of fragrance should reflect her own personality rather than conforming to a gentleman's preferences," he said diplomatically. "Though I must say Miss Johnson's creations all seem exceptional." His graceful deflection, which managed to complement both Pamela's work and Catherine's autonomy, impressed Pamela despite herself. It would have been easy for him to play along with Mrs. Peterson's transparent attempt at matchmaking for her daughter. Over the next half hour, the shop grew surprisingly busy as more women of Redstone Ridge found sudden need for perfumes and tonics. Pamela moved efficiently among them, answering questions and packaging purchases, all the while conscious of Chad's presence as he conversed easily with those who approached him. To her surprise, sales mounted rapidly. Mrs. Peterson purchased not only the violet perfume for Catherine, but also rose water and a jar of Pamela's special hand cream for herself. Others followed suit, some buying Pamela's most expensive fragrances after years of selecting only the most modest options. It wasn't until Mrs. Thornton approached the counter with Pamela's costliest perfume, an exotic blend of jasmine and sandalwood she called Midnight Promise, that Pamela fully realized what was happening. The women weren't just curious about Chad, they were eager to display their refinement and purchasing power before this sophisticated visitor. "A lovely choice, Mrs. Thornton," she said, wrapping the crystal bottle carefully. "This is one of my personal favorites." "It's exquisite," Mrs. Thornton replied, casting a glance toward Chad, who was examining a display of men's colognes. "One must support quality craftsmanship, especially when it originates in our own community." The irony of this statement, coming so soon after Harrison's decision to reduce her products in favor of factory-made alternatives, wasn't lost on Pamela, but she merely smiled and accepted payment, adding the substantial sum to her day's receipts. When the shop finally emptied of customers, Pamela found herself alone with Chad once more. He approached the counter, his expression amused. "You seem to have quite a devoted clientele, Ms. Johnson." "Curiously more devoted today than usual," she replied dryly. "I suspect their sudden enthusiasm for fine fragrances might have something to do with the presence of a distinguished visitor." Chad laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "If my presence has increased your sales, I'm happy to have been of service, though I believe the quality of your products is the true reason for their purchases." Pamela began organizing the counter, which had become cluttered during the rush. "What brings you to Redstone Ridge, Mr. Montgomery, besides your promised call upon me?" "I'm considering some investments in the region, timber primarily, though I have interests in other areas as well." He watched her hands as she sorted receipt slips. "I've always believed in evaluating potential opportunities personally, rather than relying solely on reports from others." "And is Redstone Ridge providing suitable opportunities?" Pamela asked, curious despite herself. "Increasingly so." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Would you permit me to call on you again tomorrow, Miss Johnson? Perhaps you might show me something of the town." The request, though conventionally phrased, carried implications Pamela wasn't sure she was ready to address. A walk through town with Chad Montgomery would signal a level of acquaintance, perhaps even courtship, that would set tongues wagging even more vigorously than they already were. Yet she found herself nodding. "I close the shop at 5. I could spare an hour afterward, though I'm afraid Redstone Ridge offers little in the way of sights compared to more established cities." "On the contrary," Chad replied, placing his hat back on his head with a fluid motion that spoke of ingrained gentility. "I find it offers attractions entirely unique to itself." His smile made it clear that she was foremost among those attractions. "Until tomorrow, then, 5 o'clock. After he departed, Pamela remained at the counter, staring at the door through which he had disappeared. The day's sales receipts, nearly equal to a full week's normal business, sat before her, tangible evidence of how thoroughly Chad Montgomery had disrupted the usual patterns of Redstone Ridge with his mere presence. Just as thoroughly, she realized with a mixture of irritation and anticipation as he had disrupted her carefully ordered thoughts since their first meeting in Aunt Judith's garden. As 5 o'clock approached, Pamela found herself glancing repeatedly at the small clock on her shop wall, her hands uncommonly clumsy as she arranged bottles on the shelves. The promised hour for Chad's return loomed, and with it a growing uncertainty about the wisdom of agreeing to show him around town. She had just turned the sign to closed and begun counting the day's receipts when the shop bell jangled. Chad Montgomery stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, his tall figure somehow making the shop seem smaller than it had moments before. "Right on time, I see," Pamela said, securing the cash box beneath the counter. A man who cannot keep his appointments punctually is unlikely to keep his promises in other matters. Chad removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight wave to it. "Are you ready for our walk, or do you need more time?" Pamela untied her shop apron and hung it on a hook behind the counter. "Just let me fetch my shawl." As she reached for the light woolen wrap she kept for evening errands, Chad's gaze traveled appreciatively over the orderly shelves and gleaming bottles of her shop. "You've created something remarkable here," he said. "Not many would have the vision to establish such a specialized business in a frontier town." The simple observation, spoken without the condescension she'd grown accustomed to from men regarding her little shop, caught Pamela off guard. "Thank you, though I'm not sure it was vision so much as necessity. I arrived in Redstone Ridge with limited funds and a single skill I could market." "You undervalue yourself. Creating something from nothing is the very definition of vision." Chad offered his arm as they stepped outside. "Now, where shall we begin our tour of Redstone Ridge?" For the next half hour, Pamela guided him along the town's main street, pointing out establishments of note: the general store, the blacksmith's shop, the small lending library recently established by the Ladies' Improvement Society. Chad listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed a keen understanding of frontier economics. As they passed Harrison's general store, Pamela's steps faltered slightly. Through the window, she could see Harrison himself arranging a new display near the counter. Factory-made toiletries in fancy packaging already occupying the prime space that had once held her products. Chad followed her gaze. "Is something wrong?" Pamela hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing of consequence, just a recent business disappointment." "Tell me," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. Perhaps it was the genuine interest in his tone, or simply the relief of speaking to someone outside the closed circle of Redstone Ridge society, but Pamela found herself explaining Harrison's decision to reduce her shelf space in favor of mass-produced products from St. Louis. "He claims customers prefer the modern packaging and printed labels," she concluded as they continued walking. "Never mind that the contents are inferior and mass-produced." Chad's expression had darkened as she spoke. "And this decision came suddenly, without warning?" "Very suddenly, and unlike him, to be honest. Harrison has always been supportive of local businesses." They had reached the end of the main street, where Redstone Ridge's sole restaurant occupied a corner building with large windows overlooking the town square. The Silver Spoon catered primarily to hotel guests and the occasional wealthy traveler, its prices beyond the means of most local residents for regular dining. Chad paused, glancing at the restaurant and then at the setting sun. "I find I'm reluctant to conclude our conversation. Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner? I'm told this is the best establishment in town." Pamela's first instinct was to refuse. Dining publicly with Chad would only fuel the gossip already circulating after his visit to her shop. Yet the alternative, returning to her solitary apartment and the cold supper she'd planned, suddenly seemed unnecessarily austere. "That would be pleasant," she heard herself say. "Though I should warn you, the Silver Spoon's definition of best may not match what you're accustomed to in larger cities." Chad smiled, the dimple appearing in his cheek. "I've found that good company matters far more than elaborate surroundings." Inside, the restaurant's modest elegance represented Redstone Ridge's aspirations, rather than its frontier reality. White tablecloths, reasonably good china, and a menu that attempted to bridge the gap between Eastern sophistication and Western practicality greeted them. The proprietor, Mr. Fleming, practically tripped over himself in his haste to welcome Chad. Evidently, the hotel had informed him of their distinguished guest's presence in town. "Mr. Montgomery," We're honored to have you dine with us this evening." Fleming cast an approving glance at Pamela. "And Miss Johnson as well. Please, allow me to offer you our best table." He led them to a corner table by the window, normally reserved for visiting railroad officials or the occasional state politician. Pamela could feel the eyes of the restaurant's few other patrons following them with undisguised curiosity. "The trout is excellent," Fleming said as he held Pamela's chair. "Caught fresh this morning from Bear Creek." After he departed to fetch water and bread, Pamela raised an eyebrow at Chad. "You've made quite an impression on our little town in less than a day. Mr. Fleming doesn't usually fuss so over guests." "The privileges and burdens of being a novelty," Chad replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Though I suspect your presence is a significant factor in his attentiveness, he clearly holds you in high regard, only because I provide the cologne his wife favors." Pamela unfolded her napkin, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched by the other diners. "Now, shall we agree to discuss something other than my business difficulties this evening? I find I'd rather not dwell on Harrison's betrayal while trying to enjoy dinner." "As you wish." Chad leaned back slightly as Fleming returned with a basket of warm bread. "Though I hope you'll permit me to return to the subject another time. I may have some suggestions that could benefit your situation." After they had ordered, the trout for Pamela, venison for Chad, a momentary silence fell between them. Pamela found herself studying his face in the warm lamplight. There was a strength to his features that suggested a man accustomed to overcoming obstacles, yet his eyes held a warmth that softened what might otherwise have been an intimidating countenance. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Montgomery," she said impulsively. "You seem to know a great deal about me, while I know very little about you beyond your business interests. What would you like to know?" His directness, as always, caught her off guard. "How did you come to be a businessman? Was it a family tradition?" A shadow crossed his face briefly. "Not exactly. My father was a plantation owner in Mississippi. Before the war, our family's wealth came from cotton and the labor that produced it." The careful phrasing made his meaning clear. Pamela tensed slightly, her suspicions about his Southern background seeming confirmed. "The war changed everything, of course," Chad continued, his gaze steady on hers. "I fought for the Confederacy. Not a popular admission in these parts, I realize. But when I returned home in '65, I found our lands confiscated, our house burned, my parents dead of typhoid." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, silenced any judgment Pamela might have formed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Chad acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Like many, I had to rebuild from nothing. I worked as a logging foreman initially, then saved enough to purchase a small timber operation when the owner decided to return east. From there, I expanded, gradually, carefully reinvesting profits, diversifying into shipping, then cattle." His smile returned. "Not unlike what you've done with your perfumery, though on a different scale." "Hardly the same," Pamela demurred as Fleming arrived with their meals. "My little shop is a far cry from your business empire." "The principles are identical. Vision, determination, willingness to take calculated risks." Chad waited until Fleming had departed before continuing. "Which is why I believe you should consider expanding your business beyond Redstone Ridge." The suggestion caught Pamela by surprise. "Expand? How?" "You've created fragrances that rival anything produced in eastern cities from what I observed today. Why limit their distribution to a single frontier town? Denver, St. Louis, even San Francisco could provide markets for products of your quality." Pamela cut a small piece of trout, considering his words. "The idea has occurred to me, but the practical obstacles are significant. Distribution channels, packaging suitable for shipping, capital for increased production, all surmountable problems with the right approach." Chad's enthusiasm was infectious. "You could begin modestly, perhaps an arrangement with a quality mercantile in Denver, and expand as demand justifies." For the remainder of the meal, they discussed possibilities that Pamela had previously dismissed as impractical dreams. Chad listened to her ideas attentively, offering insights based on his own business experience, rather than dismissing her aspirations as Davis invariably had. "You need to emphasize the handcrafted, artisanal nature of your products," he said as they shared a slice of apple pie. "That's your advantage over the factory-produced alternatives." Customers with discernment will pay a premium for quality and exclusivity, assuming they have the opportunity to discover that quality, Pamela pointed out, which returns us to the distribution problem. A problem with multiple solutions. Chad signaled for the check. I have contacts in several Western cities who might be interested in quality goods like yours. With your permission, I could make inquiries. Pamela studied him, trying to discern his motivation. That's very generous, Mr. Montgomery, but why would you take such an interest in my modest business affairs? His gaze held hers steadily. Because I recognize quality and determination when I encounter it. Those are rare enough qualities to merit support, regardless of the scale of the enterprise. He hesitated, then added more softly, and because I enjoy seeing your eyes light up when you speak of your creations. The simple honesty of the statement brought warmth to Pamela's cheeks. Before she could formulate a response, Fleming appeared with the bill, which Chad settled with a generous tip that ensured the Silver Spoon's continued hospitality during his stay. Outside, the spring evening had turned cool, with stars appearing in the darkening sky above Redstone Ridge. Chad offered his arm for the short walk back to Pamela's shop. Thank you for a most enjoyable evening, he said as they strolled. Your company is as refreshing as your perspective. I should be thanking you, Pamela replied. The dinner was your invitation, after all. The pleasure was entirely mine. They had reached her shop door and Chad paused, making no move to prolong the evening inappropriately. Would you permit me to call on you again tomorrow? Perhaps we could continue our discussion about potential markets for your perfumes. The formal phrasing of the request, coupled with his respectful distance, reassured Pamela that his interest, whatever its nature, was honorable. Yes, I think I would like that, though perhaps in the afternoon. Mornings are typically my busiest time. 3:00 then? When she nodded, Chad took her hand and bowed slightly over it, the gesture courtly without being theatrical. Until tomorrow, Miss Johnson. Sleep well. Pamela watched from her doorway as he walked toward the Cattleman's Hotel, his tall figure silhouetted against the gaslights recently installed along the main street. Only when he had disappeared from view did she climb the stairs to her apartment, her mind replaying moments from their conversation. Despite her determination to remain unaffected, she found herself smiling as she prepared for bed. Chad Montgomery was unlike any man she had encountered, direct yet courteous, ambitious yet ethical, confident yet willing to listen. His interest in her business seemed genuine, his respect for her independence refreshing after years of condescension from men like Davis. He's still a Southern businessman, she reminded herself aloud as she brushed her hair before the small mirror, and he'll be gone from Redstone Ridge within days. Yet as she extinguished her lamp and settled beneath the quilt, Pamela couldn't quite banish the memory of Chad's smile or the warmth in his dark eyes when he spoke of her remarkable achievements. The next morning brought confirmation that Redstone Ridge's efficient gossip network had been operating at full capacity. Pamela had barely unlocked her shop door when the first curious customers began to arrive, women who normally purchased perfume perhaps once or twice a year, suddenly finding urgent need for fragrances and tonics. Mrs. Thornton appeared before 9:00, ostensibly seeking more of the hand cream she had purchased only yesterday. We missed you at the quilting circle last night, Miss Johnson, she said, her tone carefully casual as she examined a display of toilet waters. Though I understand you had a more pleasant engagement, Mr. Montgomery seems quite the gentleman. He is indeed, Pamela replied neutrally, wrapping the hand cream. Very knowledgeable about business matters. Business matters, of course. Mrs. Thornton's smile suggested she believed otherwise. I understand he's staying in Redstone Ridge for some time, most unusual for a man of his standing. I really couldn't say what Mr. Montgomery's plans entail. Pamela kept her tone pleasant but firm. That will be 75 cents for the cream. As Mrs. Thornton departed, 3 more women entered, their expressions bright with curiosity, barely disguised as shopping interest. By 10:00, the shop was busier than Pamela had ever seen it, with customers browsing, whispering, and purchasing items they had ignored for months. The bell jangled again, revealing Sarah Wilkins, who surveyed the crowded shop with raised eyebrows before making her way to the counter. Need some help? She murmured as Pamela wrapped yet another bottle of cologne for Mrs. Peterson's unmarried sister, who had developed a sudden interest in personal fragrance. Desperately, Pamela whispered back. Can you manage the counter while I mix more bay rum? I've sold out my entire stock this morning. With pleasure. Sarah moved behind the counter with the ease of familiarity while Pamela retreated to her workroom. The momentary quiet was a blessed relief. Pamela leaned against her workbench, taking a deep breath of the herbal-scented air. The morning sales had already exceeded a typical week's receipts, but the strain of maintaining a pleasant demeanor under the onslaught of thinly veiled prying had left her exhausted. Sarah appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. I've sent the last of them away with promises that the special order of lavender water will arrive next week. That should give you a breather. Thank you. Pamela began gathering ingredients for a fresh batch of bay rum. I've never seen such a rush. Haven't you? Sarah's expression was knowing. A handsome, wealthy bachelor paying obvious attention to Redstone Ridge's most independent lady? It's better than a circus coming to town. She leaned against the doorframe. The hotel dining room was abuzz with it at breakfast. Mr. Montgomery took his meal there this morning, you know. Very cordial to everyone, but deflected all attempts to extract information about his relationship with you. There is no relationship, Pamela protested, measuring cloves into a mortar. Merely a business acquaintance. Business acquaintance? Is that what they're calling it now? Sarah's eyes danced with amusement. The Silver Spoon says otherwise. According to Fleming's wife, you two looked very cozy at that corner table. Pamela felt heat rise to her cheeks. We discussed potential markets for my perfumes, hardly the stuff of romance. Sarah's skeptical tone made it clear she wasn't convinced. And did these potential markets explain why he was seen entering Harrison's store this morning, looking like a thundercloud? Pamela's hand stilled in the act of grinding the cloves. He went to Harrison's? Why? No one knows for certain. He was inside for perhaps 15 minutes. When he emerged, Harrison looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah moved into the workroom, lowering her voice, though no customers remained in the shop. And that's not all. Billy Watson says Mr. Montgomery spent an hour at Harriet Cooper's office yesterday afternoon. Something about property deeds. Property deeds? Pamela frowned, trying to connect these disparate pieces of information. What property? That's the interesting part. According to Billy, who, as you know, misses nothing that happens in that office, Mr. Montgomery has purchased the building that houses Harrison's store. Sarah's expression was triumphant at delivering this choice bit of gossip. Paid cash, apparently. The deed transfer was completed yesterday. The pestle slipped from Pamela's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the mortar. He bought Harrison's building? Why would he do that? Why indeed? Sarah raised an eyebrow significantly. Perhaps it has something to do with a certain shopkeeper whose products were recently removed from Harrison's shelves? That's absurd, Pamela protested, though a nagging suspicion had begun to form in her mind. Only arrived in town yesterday. Harrison reduced my shelf space last week. True, but wasn't Mr. Montgomery at your cousin's wedding before that? And didn't your mother introduce you to him there? Sarah's expression grew more serious. I'm not saying there's definitely a connection, but it's a remarkable coincidence, isn't it? Before Pamela could respond, the shop bell jangled again. Sarah peeked through the doorway, then turned back with a knowing smile. Well, well, speak of the devil and he appears. Looking particularly handsome today, I might add. She straightened her apron. I'll leave you to your business acquaintance, shall I? But I expect full details later. Pamela barely had time to collect herself before Sarah had slipped out through the back door and Chad appeared in the shop doorway, his tall frame filling the space. Today he was dressed more casually than before, in a manner better suited to the frontier town, though the quality of his clothing still marked him as a man of means. Good morning, Miss Johnson, he greeted her, his smile causing that treacherous dimple to appear. I hope I'm not interrupting your work? Not at all. Pamela wiped her hands on a cloth, conscious of the clove oil that scented her fingers. I was just preparing a fresh batch of bay rum. It seems my stock was unexpectedly depleted this morning. Business is good, then? Chad glanced around the workroom with interest. I'm pleased to hear it. Remarkably good. It seems Redstone Ridge has developed a sudden enthusiasm for personal fragrances. She fixed him with a direct look, almost as sudden as your enthusiasm for local real estate. Chad's expression revealed nothing beyond mild interest. I beg your pardon? I understand you've purchased the building that houses Harrison's General Store. Pamela crossed her arms. A curious investment for a man just passing through town. Ah. Chad nodded slightly, making no attempt to deny the information. News travels quickly in small communities, particularly when the news involves a stranger making significant property purchases. Pamela held his gaze steadily. Why, Mr. Montgomery? What possible interest could you have in a building in Redstone Ridge? Property is generally a sound investment, regardless of location. His tone was perfectly reasonable, his expression guileless. The building is well constructed, centrally located, and offered at a fair price. And the fact that my products were recently removed from the store it houses is merely coincidental, Pamela pressed, unwilling to let the matter drop. A flicker of something, amusement, admiration, crossed Chad's face. You have a very direct way about you, Miss Johnson. It's most refreshing. And you have a very evasive way of answering questions, Mr. Montgomery. Not evasive, merely selective. He moved further into the workroom, examining the neat arrangement of bottles and ingredients with genuine interest. Would you believe me if I said I purchased the building because I consider it a sound investment that might also benefit a businesswoman I've come to admire? The simple statement, delivered without pretense, momentarily silenced Pamela's questions. No man had ever described her as a businesswoman worthy of admiration, not even those who grudgingly acknowledged her success. I'm not sure what to believe, she admitted finally. Your actions seem significant for a man I've met only twice before. Sometimes significant actions are warranted after only brief acquaintance. Chad's gaze held hers with the same intensity she remembered from their dance at Eliza's wedding. I told you then that I'm a man who knows his own mind, Miss Johnson. That hasn't changed. The implications of his statement hung in the air between them, neither acknowledged nor denied. Pamela found herself unable to look away from his dark eyes, which seemed to see past her carefully maintained composure to the uncertainty beneath. The shop bell's jangling broke the moment. With a murmured excuse, Pamela moved past him to attend to the customer, her pulse racing in a manner that had nothing to do with the shop's sudden busyness. For the remainder of the morning, Chad remained in the shop, sometimes observing quietly, other times engaging customers in conversation that inevitably led to additional sales. His presence both unsettled and intrigued Pamela, who found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the man before her with his inexplicable actions. By noon, she had sold more inventory than she typically moved in 3 full days of business. When the last customer finally departed, Pamela turned the sign to "closed" with a sigh of relief. You look exhausted, Chad observed, his tone sympathetic. Perhaps we should postpone our meeting until tomorrow when you've had a chance to rest. The consideration in his voice touched Pamela more than she cared to admit. Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I just need a moment to gather my thoughts. It's been an unusual morning. So I gathered. Chad's smile held a hint of apology. I seem to have disrupted your normal routine quite thoroughly. That's one way of putting it. Despite her fatigue, Pamela found herself returning his smile. Though I can hardly complain about the increased sales, whatever their motivation, as she secured the day's substantial receipts in her cash box, Pamela found herself wondering just how long Chad Montgomery would remain in Redstone Ridge, and why the prospect of his departure left her feeling oddly bereft, despite the disruption his presence had caused. She glanced up to find him watching her with an expression that suggested he could read her thoughts. Perhaps he could. He had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate her reaction since their first meeting. Shall we continue our discussion about expanding your business over lunch? He suggested. The hotel dining room is surprisingly adequate and less formal than the Silver Spoon. Pamela hesitated only briefly before nodding. Whatever Chad Montgomery's ultimate intentions toward her or her business might be, she couldn't deny that his company both challenged and stimulated her in ways she had thought herself immune to after Davis's betrayal. Lunch would be lovely, she said, reaching for her shawl. And perhaps afterward you might explain your sudden interest in Redstone Ridge real estate. Chad's laugh was warm and genuine. I look forward to the attempt, though I doubt I'll satisfy your curiosity entirely. He offered his arm as they stepped outside into the spring sunshine. Some mysteries are best revealed gradually, don't you agree? Pamela placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fine fabric of his coat. I've never had much patience for mysteries, Mr. Montgomery. I prefer clarity in all things. Then clarity you shall have, in time. The look he gave her as they walked toward the hotel held both promise and challenge. For now, shall we agree to enjoy each other's company without excessive analysis? Despite her determination to remain wary, Pamela found herself nodding. There would be time enough to unravel the mystery of Chad Montgomery's actions. For now, the simple pleasure of his company and the unexpected boost to her business his presence had provided seemed reason enough to set aside her reservations, if only temporarily.